Chapter 268. When Zhang Chen closed his eyes, he instantly sensed that someone was spying on him. The killing intent in his heart instantly erupted forth. If news of this were to spread, Zhang Chen, the chosen of the Pill Emperor Hall, would do anything to achieve his goals, even sacrificing his own lover. The Pill Emperor Hall would definitely not spare him. The person spying on him had to die. Let's go. Qin Wendian knew that Zhang Chen had discovered them the instant he dashed out. He hadn't expected Zhang Chen's perception to be so strong. Grabbing Bai Lu Yi's hand, Qin Wendian retreated with explosive speed. "Sir, it's best if you stay behind." Zhang Chen's voice drifted over from behind, as a terrifying coldness gushed forth, enveloping Qin Wendian and Bai Lu Yi. Just the intensity of that killing intent was enough to cause them to shiver in fear. How could Qin Wendian and Bai Lu Yi stop? Executing the Garuda movement technique, Qin Wendian increased his speed to the maximum. Zhang Chen, who was behind them, flicked his finger as an astral sword appeared in front of him. Zhang Chen's silhouette flickered as the astral sword pierced through the air, causing dust and sand to rise up in the air. However, the distance between Zhang Chen and Qin Wendian was rapidly shortening. Although Qin Wendian's movement technique was strong, his cultivation base was only at the 3rd level of Yuanfu. Bai Lu Yi was the same as well, while Zhang Chen was at the peak of Yuanfu and ranked number 11 on the Heavenly Fate rankings. How could Qin Wendian compare to his speed? The difference in strength was too great. Qin Wendian's countenance was incredibly unsightly to behold, as a cold light flickered in his eyes. He had never imagined that he would stumble upon Zhang Chen's secret. Bzzz. Qin Wendian's palms trembled as the Yellow Springs monument shot out, landing on the hillside in front of them. Go up. Qin Wendian and Bai Lu Yi directly stepped onto the Yellow Springs monument, causing a terrifying aura to permeate the air. Qin Wendian's footsteps trembled as the Yellow Springs monument emitted a blood-colored glow. Zhang Chen dashed over, yet he abruptly halted his steps as he stared at Qin Wendian, who had already entered a divine inscription trap. His palms trembled as a screen of swords appeared in front of him. Die! Zhang Chen spat out a single word, and the screen of swords transformed into a sharp sword shadow that shot towards Qin Wendian. Go down! Qin Wendian pulled Bai Lu Yi along with him as they tumbled down the hill. The screen of swords whistled past their heads, exuding a bone-piercing chill. Zhang Chen coldly snorted. The sword light beneath his feet grew sharper and sharper, as though a boundless sword keening could be heard. He stepped out, stepping on his sword as he dashed towards the center of the divine inscription formation, dashing straight towards Qin Wendian. Qin Wendian's countenance was incredibly unsightly to behold. He was truly unwilling to die like this. Little Yi, Wendian. At this moment, a voice rang out from the side. A glimmer of hope appeared on Bai Lu Yi's pale countenance. Only now did Qin Wendian notice a silhouette sprinting over from the side. It was none other than Bai Lu Jing. A resolute look flashed in Qin Wendian's eyes. With a flick of his finger, fresh blood gushed forth. His finger imprinted itself onto the Yellow Springs monument as a blood-colored light frenziedly flowed into it. Zhang Chen casually waved his hand, and an earth-shattering sword appeared in the air, slashing towards Qin Wendian and Bai Lu Yi. Qin Wendian's body flipped, and the Yellow Springs monument abruptly blasted out, aiming straight for Zhang Chen. A thunderous boom echoed out, and Zhang Chen could feel his heart pounding as his blood vessels trembled. At the same time, the sword slammed into the Yellow Springs monument. Rumble. The Yellow Springs monument was repelled by the sword strike, slamming ruthlessly into Qin Wendian's body. Qin Wendian and Bai Lu Yi's bodies slid down the slope as they coughed out mouthfuls of blood. Bai Lu Jing had finally arrived. Stay your hand! Zhang Chen roared. His body turned illusory, akin to a shadow. In an instant, a fearsome killing art descended from the skies, slashing towards Zhang Chen. Zhang Chen's eyes widened in shock, his body trembling violently. Zhang Chen stabbed out with his finger, and a terrifying sword intent transformed into countless sword fragments, landing on the resplendent golden line of light. The golden line of light descended from the heavens, and the sword fragments completely dissipated, but it still continued to descend, slashing towards Zhang Chen's body. 9 slashes of the great sun. Zhang Chen's eyes narrowed, and the sword qi around him intensified. He stabbed out with his finger, landing on the golden line of light, and the terrifying destructive might caused the surrounding space to crackle. Finally, under the might of this finger strike, the golden line of light dissipated, and Bailu Jing appeared in front of Qin Wendian and Bailu Yi. "Brother!" Bailu Yi called out. A cold light flickered in Bailu Jing's eyes as he stared at Zhang Chen. Ranked 56th on the Heavenly Fate rankings, Bailu Jing. "Based on your strength, you should be able to advance a little further in the next ranking battle," Zhang Chen stated, staring at Bailu Jing. Bailu Jing's eyes flashed with killing intent. That earlier strike of Zhang Chen's was clearly aimed at killing Qin Wendian and Bailu Yi. A terrifying aura gushed forth from him as Bailu Jing released his astral souls. 3 astral souls appeared, one was the Blazing Flames astral soul, one was the Wind Shadow astral soul, and the last was the 7 Slaughters astral soul. The 3 astral souls originated from the 3rd, 4th and 5th heavenly layers respectively. Zhang Chen, who was usually calm and composed, was now emanating a towering killing intent. "Big Brother Jing, this is just a misunderstanding." At this moment, Qin Wendian's voice drifted over. Bailu Jing froze for a moment, only to hear Qin Wendian continuing, "Zhang Chen, you chased after me and Bailu Yi for no reason at all. Is there a misunderstanding?" Zhang Chen was ranked number 11 on the Heavenly Fate rankings, a heavens chosen from the Pill Emperor Hall. Even if Bailu Jing was strong, if a battle really erupted, it would be disadvantageous to them. Zhang Chen glanced at Qin Wendian, only to see that his opponent's eyes were clear, without the slightest hint of hatred. He didn't expect Qin Wendian's schemes to run so deep, purposely acting as if it was a misunderstanding. In reality, Qin Wendian was hinting to him that he would pretend he didn't know what he saw earlier. As for the fact that he almost killed Qin Wendian didn't seem to care at all. Did he really not care? One could only say that Qin Wendian was extremely good at enduring. "Ha, Zhang Chen, you're actually here as well." From afar, 2 silhouettes could be seen walking over. It was none other than Zhao Lai and the first elder of the Li clan. The first elder of the Li clan was extremely unlucky to have met Zhao Lai, hence he was forced to lead the way. "This is the Divine Inscriptionist Grandmaster." If that's the case, that's even better. With 2 Divine Inscriptionists here, we should be able to leave this damned place. Zhao Lai's gaze landed on Qin Wendian, as a fiery light flickered in his eyes. He initially thought that Zhang Chen was forcing Qin Wendian to lead the way, but Bailu Jing didn't agree, resulting in the confrontation. "Hee, I think so too. Grandmaster Qin should be willing to lead the way, right?" Zhang Chen coldly asked as he stared at Qin Wendian. Qin Wendian understood that as long as he didn't die, the killing intent in Zhang Chen's heart wouldn't diminish. But wasn't he the same as well? If there was a chance, he would definitely kill Zhang Chen. Naturally. Qin Wendian laughed, agreeing to Zhang Chen's request. "With little brother Qin leading the way, our journey would be much smoother." Old First laughed, the tense atmosphere from earlier dissipating into nothingness. Bailu Yi naturally understood the meaning behind Qin Wendian's words. She kept her mouth shut and pretended as though nothing had happened. However, as they continued onwards, Qin Wendian and Bailu Yi maintained a certain distance from Zhang Chen. Bailu Jing didn't ask anything, but how could he not understand the hidden meaning behind Qin Wendian's words? After a moment, they returned to the location where Zhang Chen and Qin Yu were conversing. At this moment, there was an additional interspatial ring. Not only that, there were other experts from the Hua clan present as well. "They're all here." A voice drifted over from behind. Everyone turned their heads, only to see Yang Fan, Zhu Sha, and Bailu Jing walking over. The 3 of them were all experts from the star-seizing manor. They had actually gathered together. At this moment, the gazes of Yang Fan and Zhu Sha landed on Qin Wendian. A cold light flickered in their eyes, containing a hint of killing intent. From their point of view, Qin Wentian had to be held responsible for the deaths of over 10 experts from the star-seizing manor. However, they knew that now wasn't the time to deal with Qin Wentian. They still needed to borrow his strength to pass through the formation. Grandmaster Qin, please lead the way. Zhan Chen gestured to Qin Wentian. Qin Wentian glanced at the people in front of him. His countenance was calm, but in his heart, he knew that he was in an extremely precarious situation. Right. Nodding his head, Qin Wentian began to inscribe the formation in front of him. Bailu Jing and Bailu Yi stood behind Qin Wentian, while Old Li followed Qin Wentian, joining forces to decipher the formation. Qin Wentian's movements were extremely slow, causing Old Li to feel that something was amiss. It was as though Qin Wentian was doing this on purpose. In reality, Qin Wentian had been waiting for an opportunity. But when he thought of the strength of those behind him, he knew that it would be impossible for him to kill all of them in a single move. Zhan Chen, Yang Fan, Zhao Lai and Hua Feng were all rankers on the Heavenly Fate rankings. It would be too difficult if he wanted to ambush them while he was deciphering the formation. An instant later, Qin Wentian picked up one of the interspatial rings, leaving the other one behind. Old Li froze as he picked up the interspatial ring. His eyes sunk in as an expression of agony appeared on his face. Third brother. Old Li clutched the interspatial ring tightly. All of a sudden, his gaze froze as he saw the word Zhan inscribed in front of Qin Wentian's body. Zhan Chen. Old Li's heart trembled as his body trembled unstably. Drawing in a deep breath, he pretended that he hadn't seen it, yet a glint of hatred flickered in his eyes. Qin Wentian's body blocked the words, and after he finished inscribing them, he immediately erased them as he continued to decipher the formation. Those behind him quietly followed behind. Gradually, the pine trees and ancient peaks appeared before their eyes, as though they were just inches away from them. They were getting closer, they were almost there. Fluctuations of divine inscriptions. Qin Wentian abruptly shifted his gaze forward. Although the pine trees and ancient peaks were just inches away from him, there was an indistinct feeling to them, as though there was a barrier of divine inscriptions blocking their path. Qin Wentian's movements involuntarily halted as he closed his eyes, quietly sensing the barrier of divine inscriptions in front of him. Qin Wentian could also sense that they were just a step away from the exit. Chapter 269. Those behind couldn't help but frown when they saw Qin Wentian stopping. A baleful aura radiated from Zhu Sha as he coldly asked, "What are you doing?" "It's hard to break the formation, I have to focus on comprehending it." "If you don't feel at ease, why don't you try it yourself?" Qin Wentian coldly replied, his words causing Zhu Sha to snort coldly, but he didn't say anything else. Instead, he stared at Qin Wentian with a cold glint in his eyes. After this matter was concluded, he would definitely teach Qin Wentian a lesson. A mere divine inscriptionist actually dared to be so arrogant, not knowing the immensity of death. Qin Wentian naturally understood the killing intent in Zhu Sha's heart, yet he pretended to be oblivious to it, closing his eyes and meditating for half a day. Behind him, a few others also arrived, but they were all waiting quietly. Finally, Qin Wentian opened his eyes as he spoke to Bailu Jing and Bailu Yi, "Big brother Jing, the two of you, try placing your hands on these two positions." After speaking, Qin Wentian's palm streaked across the air as a beam of astral light shot out, landing on two positions on the rampart. "Right." Bailu Jing and Bailu Yi nodded as they advanced forward. "Wait a minute." Behind them, someone suddenly spoke. It was none other than Zhu Sha. His countenance flashed with sharpness as he asked, "Why the two of them?" "It's just a probe, and there's a certain level of danger. If Senior is willing to act, I'm naturally more than willing." Qin Wentian turned, smiling. Zhu Sha's countenance sank as he stared at Qin Wentian, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. This young man's schemes were extremely deep, he had already tricked them once before, intentionally asking for their help. Yet when they refused, he found someone from the White Deer Institute and left. This time around, they mustn't fall for his tricks so easily. Maybe, he was intentionally letting Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi go up, luring them to act. Let them go first. Zhu Sha, the two of you follow behind. Yang Fan spoke, glancing at Qin Wentian. He wanted to see what tricks Qin Wentian had up his sleeves. If Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi passed, Zhu Sha could enter again. Zhu Sha and the other cultivator from the star-seizing manor nodded their heads in agreement as they followed after Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi. Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi naturally trusted Qin Wentian. They pressed their palms against the location Qin Wentian had pointed to, and instantly, the divine inscription materialized, becoming clearer and clearer. Two doors abruptly appeared, and Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi's silhouettes abruptly vanished as they stepped through the doors. The countenances of Zhu Sha and Bai Lu Jing froze. Abruptly, they lunged forwards, placing their palms on the spot where the Bai Lu siblings had placed their palms. Abruptly, a terrifying baleful aura gushed forth. Be careful. Qin Wentian stepped out. However, it was already too late. Zhu Sha and Qin Wentian were sent retreating as the terrifying destructive energy gushed towards them. Scram! Zhu Sha roared in rage as he blasted out with both his palms. Two gigantic palm imprints appeared, containing a terrifying might within them. Cracking sounds rang out unceasingly as the destructive energy dissipated into nothingness. Zhu Sha drew in a breath of cold air, his palms were a mess of flesh and blood. Senior's movements were too fast, I didn't have enough time to warn you, Qin Wentian and Old First walked over, smiling at Zhu Sha. Zhu Sha's palms trembled as he stared fixedly at Qin Wentian. Didn't have enough time to warn him. How could he believe such nonsense? Glancing at his companions, they were in an even worse state. Their arms were a mess of flesh and blood. Yang Fan's countenance sank. This brat was doing this intentionally. Not to mention that Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi had already passed, and they couldn't even see their silhouettes. This divine inscription is constantly changing, we should change the location for the second time. Qin Wentian walked towards the divine inscription as he spoke. Exchanging a glance with Old First, he sent out a palm imprint. Leave them behind. The countenances of Yang Fan, Zhan Chen, and the rest all changed. Earlier, the spectators had all noticed the wall of divine inscriptions attacking Zhu Sha. Qin Wentian's hypocritical act had caused them to coldly snort in their hearts. But who would have thought that Qin Wentian would suddenly make a move? But it was already too late. With a flash of light, Qin Wentian and Old First's silhouettes vanished simultaneously, causing the countenances of all present to turn ashen. Qin Wentian and Old First arrived at the other end of the divine inscription rampart, only to see Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi there. Little brother Qin, Old Third, he. Old First asked as he stared at Qin Wentian. Zhan Chen, Bai Lu Yi, and I eavesdropped on the conversation between him and his companion. Uncle Li San was forced to break the formation and died within. Not only that, Zhan Chen even asked his companion to personally enter the divine inscription rampart to test the formation. Qin Wentian spoke, his words causing Bai Lu Jing's eyes to gleam with sharpness. Did you all eavesdrop on his secret? That's why he chased after you and little Yi. I could only pretend that nothing had happened. Zhao Lai just so happened to arrive, so Zhan Chen didn't mention this matter. Qin Wentian nodded his head as he gazed ahead. At the foot of the ancient pine peak, there was a great hall, and within it, a statue could be seen. They've arrived. Based on their strength, this divine inscription rampart won't be able to trap them. Old First spoke. If those people joined forces, they would definitely be able to break apart the divine inscription rampart. Qin Wentian nodded his head, let's go ahead and take a look. The four of them nodded their heads as they advanced towards the great hall at the foot of the ancient pine peak. There were no more traps outside, and they directly entered the great hall. The great hall was extremely spacious, and the statue in front of them resembled a human. It was extremely lifelike, and in its hands, there were two ancient scrolls. This great hall was extremely clean, and there was a layer of light enveloping it. Qin Wentian and the rest stood outside, but they didn't immediately enter. This was because there were many divine inscriptions flowing on the ground in front of them. It doesn't seem like a trap. Old first glanced at Qin Wentian. It seems like the energy of the divine inscriptions needs to be controlled by someone. Not only is it not a trap, it can even be controlled by someone proficient in divine inscriptions. Qin Wentian nodded his head, he had the same feeling as old first. Let's go up and take a look. Bai Lu Jing laughed. He was truly audacious, directly taking a step forward. Instantly, on the ground in front of the statue, a golden light flashed as beams of golden light descended, blinding the eyes of those who saw it. After which, the ground cracked apart as a few silhouettes rose up from the ground. There were a total of 9 silhouettes, all of them radiating a resplendent golden light. Their eyes were as sharp as swords as they swept their gazes over to Qin Wentian and the rest. When Qin Wentian stared into the eyes of the 9 golden-armored silhouettes, he felt as though his body was about to be pierced through by their gazes. 4 of you arrived at the same time, which one of you is the divine inscriptionist? One of the golden-armored silhouettes asked, his tone sharp. Qin Wentian stared at the golden-armored silhouette, I am. Me too. Old Manly similarly spoke, narrowing his eyes. These 9 golden-armored silhouettes seemed to be puppets, yet their eyes seemed to contain intelligence. The gaze of the golden-armored silhouette swept over Qin Wentian and Old Manly as he stated, the 9 of us are golden-armored silhouettes created by our master. Our cultivation bases are at the peak of Yuanfu, and we are tasked to protect our master's inheritance. Only one of us will be chosen, and we must be a genius with extraordinary attainments in both divine inscriptions and martial Tao. Qin Wentian's countenance flickered. On the way here, there had been many tests, and it seemed that the purpose of these tests was indeed to select the most outstanding geniuses at the peak of Yuanfu. Little E, stand behind me. Bai Lu Jing spoke. The 9 golden-armored silhouettes exuded an aura of sharpness. Among them, 4 of them stepped forward, their eyes gleaming with a terrifying killing intent. In their hands, they wielded golden long spears. They were the final test. Bai Lu Jing released his martial soul as a terrifying killing intent gushed forth from him. This was the power of the 7 slaughters astral soul. Not bad, but it's still insufficient. One of the golden-armored silhouettes glared at Bai Lu Jing. After which, he abruptly dashed out, his long spear piercing through the air, akin to a bolt of golden lightning. Bai Lu Jing took a step forward, executing the 9 beheadings of the great sun. His innate technique, infused with the will of his mandate, erupted forth as the lines of the great sun appeared in the air. Break! The golden-armored silhouette coldly roared. A bolt of lightning appeared on the tip of his long spear, slamming into the lines of the great sun, instantly shattering them apart. Bai Lu Jing's countenance stiffened. The combat prowess of this golden-armored silhouette was truly terrifying. The 9 beheadings of the great sun was unleashed once more, as rays of scorching sunlight cascaded downwards. A golden sun appeared above Bai Lu Jing's head as a terrifying storm of flames howled in rage. Even a peak-level Yuanfu cultivator would be split into 2 if they were struck by the rays of the great sun. However, the combat prowess of the golden-armored silhouette far exceeded his expectations. Bai Lu Jing had no way to deal with him. Qin Wentian and Old Li also met the attacks of the golden-armored silhouette. Qin Wentian stomped on the ground as a terrifying divine inscription erupted forth. There were many intricate and complicated divine inscriptions on the ground, all of which could be transformed into attacks for him to use. Qin Wentian unceasingly controlled the divine inscriptions to attack. However, the golden-armored silhouette was too strong, he could destroy the divine inscriptions with a single strike. Step by step, the golden-armored silhouette walked towards Qin Wentian as he icily stated, your strength is too weak, you aren't even qualified to compete for the inheritance. You deserve death. After speaking, the killing intent radiating from him intensified as he continued walking towards Qin Wentian. Qin Wentian's countenance stiffened as he coldly stated, when the refinement grounds opened, it all depended on one's own ability. The four of us were the first to arrive here, naturally it wasn't luck. Why are we not qualified to compete for the inheritance? From the start to the end, leaving aside the talent of others, just based on the tests here, the one who passed the test was none other than Qin Wentian. But at this moment, the golden-armored silhouette actually said that he wasn't qualified to compete for the inheritance. How could he not be enraged? This inheritance not only tests one's attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions, it also tests one's strength. I don't know how the four of you arrived here, but with a cultivation base at the 3rd level of Yuanfu, how can you be qualified to receive the inheritance? This inheritance should be left to those with outstanding talent in the future. The killing intent of the golden-armored silhouette didn't diminish as he continued, the inheritance doesn't belong to you. Die. As the sound of his voice faded, the golden spear once again pierced towards Qin Wentian. The sharpness in his eyes caused Qin Wentian to feel pain in his eyes. This golden-armored silhouette wasn't lying, he really wanted to kill Qin Wentian. Qin Wentian's heart grew colder. What a good, the inheritance doesn't belong to you. Chapter 270. The killing intent of the golden-armored man intensified. A terrifying sharpness gushed forth from him as he stepped out. His golden long spear stabbed out explosively once more as a bolt of golden lightning shot towards Qin Wentian. It was unknown how strong the might of this attack was. Qin Wentian stepped out consecutively as divine inscriptions flashed, manifesting an azure dragon that soared towards the golden lightning. With a thunderous boom, the divine inscriptions shattered. The 9 of us are the guardians of the inheritance, and our cultivation bases are all at the peak of Yuanfu. If the contender for the inheritance is outstanding in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions and has the support of Divine Inscriptions, he would be able to defeat us and seize the inheritance. However, you only have the attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions, how can you not die? The words spoken by the golden-armored man were extremely sharp. With every step he took, a surge of sharpness bore down on Qin Wentian, causing Qin Wentian to feel as though his body was about to be pierced through. Qin Wentian retreated, yet at this moment, the sound of whistling wind could be heard as several silhouettes dashed into the great hall. They were none other than Zhan Chen, Yang Fan, Zhao Lai, Orphan, and the rest. They had joined forces and used their strongest attack to break apart the barrier of divine inscriptions, and immediately rushed towards the great hall. Upon seeing that Qin Wentian and the rest had yet to obtain the inheritance, they heaved a sigh of relief in their hearts. Seems like Qin Wentian and the rest weren't having it easy. Zhu Sha's hands were still stained with blood. When he swept his gaze towards Qin Wentian, his killing intent was extremely sharp. Now that they had arrived here, the inheritance was already in front of them. There was no need for Qin Wentian anymore. This brat deserved to be killed. Grandmaster Qin, how do you wish to die? Zhu Sha icily asked. Qin Wentian coldly stared at him, could it be that you guys don't wish to leave this secret realm? Zhu Sha's countenance changed, only to see a golden-armored man speaking, since all of you are here, all of you have the qualifications to fight for the inheritance. If you defeat us, you will be able to obtain the treasure of the Ascendant. After that, the entire secret realm will be destroyed, and you can leave with ease. Hearing the golden-armored man's words, the killing intent in Zhu Sha's eyes intensified, and he grinned at Qin Wentian. However, Zhan Chen, Yang Fan and the others were all staring at the ancient book in the statue's hand. They didn't even have the intention to kill Qin Wentian anymore. If they could obtain the Empyrean's inheritance, it would be like adding wings to a tiger. From then on, they would become the only geniuses of their families and sections. For the various transcendent powers, regardless of sects or clans, there were countless geniuses in every generation. Right now, they were all at the peak of Yuanfu and feared the top rankers of the heavenly fate rankings. However, before them, there were also geniuses who had broken through to Heavenly Dipper, and their statuses weren't any lower than them. After them, there would still be more heaven's favorites emerging. The geniuses were all candidates to become the leaders of their respective clans and sections. Only by defeating everyone else in this cruel competition would they be able to rise above the rest and become the one and only future leader. Now, the Empyrean's inheritance was undoubtedly a great opportunity. In Zhan Chen's palms, an incomparably sharp sword appeared. This was a peak-tier, third-rank divine weapon. In Yang Fan's hands, a pair of armlets appeared, covering both his palms. This was also a peak-tier, third-rank divine weapon. Although the Heaven's favorites didn't have any fourth-rank divine weapons, it didn't mean that their sects didn't. However, they were all Heaven's favorites, and were the future leaders of their respective clans and sections. The requirements of their clans and sects were the strictest, and they wouldn't allow them to rely on powerful divine weapons. Even if they had one, it would only be used for survival or fleeing, and not for attacking purposes. This way, they might meet with danger in the outside world, but only by doing so would they be able to suppress their potential and force out their future. Even if they couldn't defeat their opponents, they would still have life-saving methods. Because, they were Heaven's favorites. If there came a day when they could surpass the other Heaven's favorites, their clans and sects would no longer restrict them. The long spears in the hands of the golden-armored warriors emitted a crisp sound, as they prepared themselves for battle. The inheritance book was right behind them. If they had the ability, they should go and get it. Zhan Chen's silhouette instantly dashed towards a golden-armored warrior. The sword in his hands slashed out, and in an instant, a resplendent rain of swords appeared in the air. This rain of swords actually congregated in the air, transforming into an incomparably sharp sword that pierced towards the head of the golden-armored warrior. The eyes of the golden-armored warrior gleamed with sharpness. The long spear in his hands trembled repeatedly, and in an instant, golden light filled the air. His palms trembled continuously as the golden light transformed into a golden screen that enveloped everything. The spear shot out, breaking apart the rain of swords. Yang Fan and the others simultaneously rushed out. His star-seizing palms contained boundless might, as though he could pluck the stars and moon from the sky. In addition to the terrifying divine weapon in his hands, his palms were filled with a terrifying destructive might, directly colliding with the long spear of the golden-armored warrior. Qin Wentian, on the other hand, wasn't having an easy time. That golden-armored warrior seemed determined to kill him no matter what. Zhu Sha, seeing that Yang Fan had already rushed over to snatch the inheritance book, turned his cold gaze onto Qin Wentian. This brat deserved death. Zhu Sha's palms glowed with an intense astral light, as though he had been tempered by the constellations. Abruptly, he dashed out, blasting out with his palms. Instantly, a resplendent astral palm imprint blasted towards Qin Wentian. Qin Wentian's countenance turned ashen. There was still another golden-armored warrior attacking him. Qin Wentian. Bai Lu stood at the side of the great hall, her countenance pale. She stepped forward, only to see Zhu Sha blasting out with a palm strike. Bai Lu groaned in agony as she coughed out fresh blood, and was directly flung out of the great hall. With her current strength, it was impossible for her to participate in the crisis-tempering grounds. Qin Wentian channeled the power of his divine inscriptions to defend against Zhu Sha's star-seizing palms. However, the terrifying palm imprint still penetrated his defenses, causing his blood and qi to churn violently. At the same time, the long spear in the hands of the golden-armored warrior stabbed out with lightning speed, causing Qin Wentian's eyes to widen in shock. This spear strike was incomparably fast, containing boundless might. There was no way he could block it. No. Bai Lu Yi's countenance turned as white as a sheet of paper. Bai Lu Jing was also being held back by the golden-armored warrior, and had no way to support Qin Wentian. Puchi. A light sound rang out as the long spear pierced through Qin Wentian's body, piercing through him. Yet, the spear was pulled out in an instant, showing how sharp it was. Qin Wentian's body was slammed into the walls of the great hall as a deafening boom echoed out. His head spun as his heart turned into ashes. Damn it! Zhu Sha coldly snorted as he once again blasted out a palm strike towards Qin Wentian. Bai Lu dashed over, blocking the attack, and with a deafening boom, her body slammed ruthlessly into Qin Wentian, causing her to cough out large mouthfuls of blood. Little E. Bai Lu Jing's countenance paled as he howled in rage. However, the strength of the golden-armored warrior in front of him was simply too terrifying. There was no time for him to be distracted, and a golden long spear almost pierced through his heart. The 9 golden-armored warriors were all at the pinnacle of Yuanfu. How difficult would it be to obtain the inheritance? Humph, Zhu Sha coldly laughed upon seeing this. He advanced forward, wanting to kill Bai Lu Yi and Qin Wentian. However, his footsteps abruptly halted as he saw the cold gazes of the golden-armored warriors boring into his body, causing him to shiver involuntarily. These golden-armored warriors didn't just want to kill Qin Wentian. They wanted to kill all of them, leaving behind only those who had the qualifications to obtain the inheritance. The golden-armored warriors launched their attacks at Zhu Sha, and Zhu Sha could only defend himself. He didn't have the time to check on Qin Wentian. Bai Lu Yi's countenance was as pale as a sheet of paper, as she walked to the side of Qin Wentian. Seeing the unceasing flow of blood, Bai Lu Yi tore a corner of her robe and pressed it against Qin Wentian's wound. Qin Wentian, wake up. Bai Lu Yi patted Qin Wentian's face as she continued, you can't fall asleep. Qin Wentian's consciousness was blurry at this moment. Zhu Sha's ferocious attack, as well as the spear strike from the golden-armored warrior. One could only imagine the severity of his injuries. He only felt a sense of dizziness, as though he wanted to sleep forever. Amidst his hazy consciousness, he could faintly sense someone calling out to him. The voices in his ears grew softer and softer, and at this moment, he fell into absolute silence. Am I going to die? I can't accept this. Qin Wentian's heart was filled with pain. There were too many things he had yet to accomplish. How could he die here? But at this moment, he really wanted to sleep. He was in so much pain that he didn't want to think about all of this. Within Qin Wentian's body, the candle flame was still blazing. Strands of golden threads intertwined around the candle flame. This candle flame was like the flame of his heart. His heart sense seemed to be contained within this candle flame. This candle flame seemed to be dimming. The calling from the outside world grew weaker and weaker, and the silhouettes around him grew more and more blurry. Was he really going to die? The cruel path of the martial path was filled with dangers and dangers. Qin Wentian had come all the way here, yet the golden-armored warrior said that he wasn't qualified to receive the inheritance. Why wasn't he qualified? Was it because his cultivation base was too low? The candle flame was still blazing. The power of his bloodline circulated around the candle flame, and the terrifying aura from the golden-armored warrior gradually weakened. However, at this moment, within the flickering light of the candle flame, Qin Wentian saw a familiar silhouette. That silhouette got closer and closer, becoming clearer and clearer. Uncle Black. Qin Wentian's heart was still trembling. Wentian. It was as though a voice rang out in his heart. You cannot die. Another voice resounded in his heart. I cannot die. An intense obsession surged in Qin Wentian's heart. How could he die? Where did Uncle Black go? Was Qingxing doing well in the Pill Emperor Hall? Dai was still in the 9 Mystical Palace. The Azure faction had yet to rise up. How could he die? The candle flame lit up. The golden threads gradually fused into the candle flame, growing brighter and brighter. In an instant, Qin Wentian's heart was lit up as well. Roar! Another surge of bloodline power roared, filled with a boundless terror. This surge of bloodline power seemed to originate from the primordial era as it let out a roar of rage. What made Qin Wentian even more shocked was that the bloodline power within his body seemed to have transformed into a gigantic primordial beast, peering down at the heavens and earth with disdain. Within the candle flame, Qin Wentian's silhouette could be seen. He inclined his head and stared at the silhouette of the primordial beast, feeling a deep sense of awe. Why was the bloodline in his body so powerful? Not only that, the power of the primordial bloodline seemed to fear the candle flame. Do you know who you are? A voice rang out in his heart. He, Qin Wentian, possessed such a powerful bloodline. Who was he? Did the golden-armored man say that he wasn't worthy of the inheritance? In that case, he wanted to see if the inheritance of this ascendant had the qualifications to say that he wasn't worthy. The candle flame grew brighter, the power of the bloodline grew stronger, and his injuries were healing. As long as the fire in his heart wasn't extinguished, he would live forever. The golden threads around the candle flame abruptly transformed into a bolt of lightning, shooting towards the center of Qin Wentian's brows. Instantly, the center of Qin Wentian's brows trembled, as though a third eye was about to open. Chapter 271. Qin Wentian only felt a piercing pain in the center of his brows, as though there was a strange energy squirming there. This strange movement seemed to be resonating with the candle flame in his body. What his heart saw was in the center of his brows. Strands of golden threads connected the candle flame to the center of his brows, and Qin Wentian could sense it even more clearly. This was also the power of a bloodline. In his body, there was more than one type of bloodline. The bloodline that was as violent as a demon, the bloodline that was once sealed by chains, was violent and terrifying, as though it came from the primordial era, like a king among demons. However, he was filled with trepidation and dread towards the candle flame. That candle flame's bloodline might even be of a higher grade than the primordial demon king's bloodline. In a person's body, there were two types of bloodlines, both of which were of such a high grade. Qin Wentian asked himself, who was he? Who were his parents? The middle-aged man he often saw in the tiny astral being should be his father, right? Why would he leave his memories in the tiny astral being for him? No matter how many thoughts ran through his mind, he had no way to answer them. He wanted to open his eyes, but to no avail. However, he discovered that he could already see everything outside. It was as though he had another eye, and the scenes outside were directly imprinted into his heart. He saw Bai Lu Yi, whose countenance was pale, worrying about his life. He saw Bai Lu Jing, who was still engaged in a life-and-death struggle, and the golden-armored guards. At this moment, Bai Lu Yi's countenance suddenly changed, as a hint of color returned to her pale countenance. She saw that Qin Wentian's wounds were no longer bleeding, and that Qin Wentian's aura was recovering, as well as his vitality. All of a sudden, Bai Lu Yi's countenance stiffened. She lifted her head, staring at the center of Qin Wentian's brows. There seemed to be a golden bolt of lightning shooting out, as though it was an eye. This. Bai Lu Yi felt her heart pounding as she stared at Qin Wentian. An instant later, the golden eye closed once more, only to see Qin Wentian opening his eyes and staring at her. You're awake. A smile appeared on Bai Lu Yi's face. This guy finally woke up. She was frightened just now. She thought that Qin Wentian would never wake up. Yes. Qin Wentian nodded and looked at the battlefield. At this moment, he realized that he could see through the cultivation of these people. Zhan Chen, Yang Fan, and Zhu Sha were all at the 9th level of Yuanfu. Even those golden-armored men had a cultivation base at the 9th level of Yuanfu. Qin Wentian frowned slightly. How was this possible? These golden-armored men actually had cultivation. Weren't they just puppets? It was clearly impossible for a puppet to have a cultivation level. However, after opening the divine golden eye, he could clearly sense that these golden-armored men had a cultivation level. The fact that the golden-armored man had a cultivation base meant that they were humans and not puppets. A stellar martial cultivator at the peak of Yuanfu, yet he was willing to be a puppet? Qin Wentian didn't understand. He glanced at the ground again. Instantly, the crisscrossing divine inscriptions appeared in his mind. There was no need for him to use his heart sense to sense them, he could see through them with a single glance. Every single divine inscription, every single complete divine inscription, could be seen with a single glance. And at this moment, his eyes suddenly lit up as a faint smile appeared on his face. So this was the case. The ascendant who left behind this inheritance was an extremely powerful Grandmaster inscriptionist. He left behind a complete 4th-rank divine inscription, and this 4th-rank divine inscription could be divided into many peak-tier, 3rd-rank divine inscriptions. Such a method truly caused one to sigh in amazement. If it weren't for the fact that there were some transformations occurring in his body, he would never have been able to comprehend it. This vast hall itself was a gigantic divine inscription. Instantly, Qin Wentian's body fused into the divine inscription. This 4th-rank divine inscription was right beneath his feet. Now that he had seen through it and comprehended it, it was extremely simple to use it. The corners of Qin Wentian's mouth curled up into a light smile. That demonic smile caused Bai Lu Yi to be dumbfounded. This fellow had changed again. What was with that eye earlier? You left a 4th-rank divine inscription here. If no one discovered it, they could only depend on their combat prowess as well as these 3rd-rank divine inscriptions to determine who the inheritor would be. But if someone discovered it, that person would be able to end everything and become your inheritor. You are truly meticulous. Qin Wendian mused in his heart. This tempering ground was all for the sake of selecting the successor he was most satisfied with. However, when he, Qin Wendian, arrived here, the golden-armored man said that he wasn't worthy, that he didn't have the qualifications to receive the inheritance. But what about now? Qin Wendian stood up, his eyes flashing with a cold sharpness as he swept his gaze over those who were currently in combat. Follow behind me. Qin Wendian smiled at Bai Lu Yi. Bai Lu Yi froze for a moment before replying, "You still want the inheritance? Let's go." After speaking, Bai Lu Yi pulled Qin Wendian along, wanting to leave. Although she knew that Qin Wendian's physique had undergone some changes, his cultivation base was still too low. Qin Wendian's cultivation base was only at the 3rd level of Yuanfu, while the people here were all geniuses at the peak of Yuanfu, ranked in the heavenly fate rankings. Even if he borrowed the power of the divine inscriptions, Qin Wendian wouldn't be able to obtain the inheritance. In fact, he might even be killed by the golden-armored man. This place was too dangerous. They had to leave. However, Bai Lu Yi only saw Qin Wendian standing there unmoving. He smiled at her, "Trust me." Bai Lu Yi's beautiful eyes froze. Before this, she had always trusted Qin Wendian. But this time around, she felt that he was unreliable. After all, what Qin Wendian wanted to do was too unrealistic. Her elder brother, Bai Lu Jing, was a ranker on the heavenly fate rankings, yet he had no hope at all. He could only defend against the attack of the golden-armored man. "You didn't die even after that?" Zhu Sha's cold voice drifted over. The golden-armored man was taken aback as he glanced at Qin Wendian with a sharp gaze. That attack of his actually failed to kill Qin Wendian? "Help me deal with him." The golden-armored man glanced at the other golden-armored men who were still guarding the statue. Momentarily, one of the golden-armored men flickered as it lunged towards Zhu Sha. The golden-armored man who was fighting against Qin Wendian also left the battle and walked towards Qin Wendian. "Your recovery speed isn't bad." The golden-armored man coldly spoke. Abruptly, his long spear erupted forth. This time around, he would never allow Qin Wendian to live. That mistake earlier was a humiliation to him. Bai Lu Yi's countenance stiffened as her countenance paled. However, she only saw Qin Wendian advancing forwards, and an instant later, the divine inscriptions on the ground lit up. Roar! An azure dragon roared, blasting towards the golden-armored man. At the same time, a terrifying great axe descended from the skies, cleaving downwards. There were also throat-slicing arrows that shot towards the golden-armored man. With every step Qin Wendian took, a towering might could be felt. The divine inscriptions around him all lit up, moving according to his will. Rumble. The terrifying attacks blasted towards the golden-armored man, causing him to stagger backwards. The divine inscriptions on the golden-armored man's body changed slightly as he stared at Qin Wendian. The terrifying divine inscriptions around him flickered unceasingly, and there were even signs that they were expanding outwards. "Huh!" The eyes of the golden-armored man narrowed. How could this be? Bai Lu-yi was also stunned. She stared in bewilderment at Qin Wentian, who was enveloped by a screen of light. His divine inscription seemed to have grown even stronger. Die! The golden-armored man roared as he stabbed out with his spear. A terrifying vortex appeared, engulfing Qin Wentian. Humph, Qin Wentian snorted. Abruptly, a gigantic python appeared from below, coiling around the golden-armored man's body. The golden-armored man howled in rage as he struggled to break free from the python's grasp, only to see a barrage of arrows shooting towards him. He twisted his spear, blocking the incoming arrows. Scram! Qin Wentian roared. With a thunderous boom, the gigantic hammer slammed into his body, sending him flying through the air. The battle here instantly attracted the attention of the other golden-armored men, as well as Zhang Chen and the rest. Their eyes involuntarily narrowed when they saw the changes in Qin Wentian. The circulating divine inscriptions grew increasingly stronger, and the entire Great Hall seemed to be trembling, as though it was about to fall under Qin Wentian's control. The entire Great Hall grew even more radiant. This. Zhu Sha's countenance turned ashen. Qin Wentian was controlling all the divine inscriptions in the Great Hall. We have to kill him first. Zhu Sha pointed to Qin Wentian as he spoke. At this moment, a thunderous rumbling sound echoed out as the divine inscriptions in the Great Hall converged together, manifesting an incomparably gigantic astral arm in the air. This. The crowd stared in shock at this scene. Was this the divine inscriptions of the Great Hall? This fellow, he's controlling all the divine inscriptions in the Great Hall. Bai Lu-yi's heart pounded as she felt the might of the astral arm. Even the ascendant who left behind the inheritance would have never imagined that the one who activated the fourth-ranked divine inscriptions would have a cultivation base at the third level of Yuanfu. If it weren't for these divine inscriptions, even if Qin Wentian underwent a transformation, he still wouldn't have the qualifications to contend against these ascendants. But this place was his battlefield. The divine inscriptions inscribed by the ascendant were prepared for him, and would be under his control. Qin Wentian stared at Zhu Sha, the coldness in his eyes causing Zhu Sha's body to involuntarily tremble. Earlier, he was the one who had attacked Qin Wentian, causing Bai Lu-yi to be heavily injured. Zhu Sha, he deserved to die. In the air, a gigantic astral arm descended from the skies. Zhu Sha could feel the terrifying might radiating from it, and he felt as though he was facing a heavenly dipper sovereign's astral arm. His heart pounded furiously. His silhouette flickered, wanting to retreat, only to see the astral arm sweeping past him. A thunderous boom rang out as the earth trembled violently. The spectators felt their hearts pounding violently as they stared at the palm imprint imprinted on the ground. The astral arm shifted away, yet Zhu Sha had already transformed into a puddle of blood. Not even his bones remained, he had been killed. Qin Wentian then turned his gaze onto the golden-armored young man. The look in his eyes actually caused the golden-armored young man's heart to involuntarily tremble. He then spoke to Qin Wentian, "Congratulations on passing the test. The inheritance belongs to you." Upon hearing the golden-armored young man's words, Qin Wentian didn't feel happy at all. On the contrary, his eyes were as cold as ever. He had almost died here, and Bai Lu-yi had almost died as well. He had participated in the refinement grounds, and there had been several life and death situations. If the golden-armored young man wasn't willing to pass the inheritance to him, he could have just let him go. Yet, the golden-armored young man had directly acted to kill him. Inheritance? Qin Wentian laughed, "I almost died here, and you're telling me that I've passed the test." Test? What qualifications do you have to test me? As the sound of Qin Wentian's voice faded, the astral arm slammed down, shattering the golden-armored young man into pieces. Chapter 272. Inheritance. Test. If you acknowledge me, then I'll acknowledge the inheritance. Before this, you said that I'm not qualified and wanted to kill me. But now, you used your life to exchange for everything, using the word test to describe everything. Right now, Qin Wentian was nothing but a predator. Since you want to pass on the inheritance, then I'll snatch it away. Seeing how Qin Wentian killed Zhu Sha and the golden-armored young man, the expressions of the people in the Great Hall all changed. Their gazes were all fixed on Qin Wentian, their countenances flickering with sharpness. At this moment, Qin Wentian swept his gaze onto Zhang Chen, as a terrifying killing intent flickered in his eyes. Zhang Chen could feel the coldness in Qin Wentian's eyes, and he knew that Qin Wentian wanted to kill him. Bzzz. A raging wind gusted by as Qin Wentian waved his palms. Momentarily, the astral arm shot towards Zhang Chen, as fast as lightning. In the Great Hall, Qin Wentian was the overlord. Zhang Chen's countenance drastically changed. His astral soul erupted forth, and his entire person was bathed in boundless sword light. His body seemed to be fused with the sword, and the terrifying whistling sounds of the sword could be heard as the astral arm trembled. Slash! Zhang Chen roared, and a blood-colored beam of light appeared on his finger, piercing through the air. Instantly, a blood-colored gigantic sword howled as it shot out. Boom! The astral arm slammed into the gigantic sword, causing it to buzz unceasingly, as though it wanted to block the path of the astral arm. Zhang Chen's countenance grew heavy as he frantically pointed his finger forward. Kill him! Zhang Chen roared, only to see Yang Fan's silhouette flickering as he lunged towards Qin Wentian. His palms could pluck the stars and seize the moon, exuding boundless might. But at the same time, Bailu Jing also appeared beside Qin Wentian. Executing the 9 beheadings of the great sun, golden rays of light manifested in the air, directly slicing apart the palm imprint. Humph! Qin Wentian coldly snorted, as thunderous rumbling sounds echoed out. The divine inscriptions on the ground howled with rage as they frenziedly swept towards Yang Fan. At the same time, a few long spears pierced towards Zhang Chen. Zhang Chen's countenance paled as he slammed out with his palms. Momentarily, a beam of light appeared in the air as Zhang Chen slashed out with his palms. Instantly, a bright light flashed as Zhang Chen's body was swept away. A light sound rang out, and the crowd only saw Zhang Chen's body reappearing outside the Great Hall. He coughed out several mouthfuls of blood. Qin Wentian turned his gaze over to Zhang Chen, who was standing outside the main hall. Their gazes met, and both of them were filled with a terrifying killing intent. They both wanted to kill each other as soon as possible. As expected of a heavens chosen from the Pill Emperor Hall, Qin Wentian was truly difficult to deal with. Even with the aid of a 4th-ranked grand formation, Qin Wentian had no way to kill him. If he only relied on his own strength, Zhang Chen would be able to kill him easily. After all, he hadn't cultivated for a long time, and his cultivation base was still shallow. Qin Wentian stared at Yang Fan once again. His astral arms were as fast as lightning, and Yang Fan's countenance was incredibly ugly to behold. He violently blasted out with his star-seizing palms, causing Yang Fan to be forced to retreat with great speed. After which, he stepped out of the Great Hall as well. If he stayed behind, with Qin Wentian controlling everything in the Great Hall, he would still die. Qin Wentian then turned his gaze to Hua Feng and the rest. Their countenances were all incomparably unsightly, and they all retreated, leaving the Great Hall. However, they didn't go too far away, and merely waited outside the Great Hall, their eyes flickering with an intense coldness. Qin Wentian could borrow the power of the divine inscriptions to control everything in the Great Hall. Nobody could contend against him, and anyone who stayed within the Great Hall would be met with a crisis of death. But even if Qin Wentian obtained the inheritance, he would still have to exit the Great Hall. As long as he did so, they would make sure that he would die without a burial ground. Those golden-armored men all stared at Qin Wentian. They understood that Qin Wentian could do whatever he wanted here, and if they stayed behind, they would all die in Qin Wentian's hands. Bzzz, the astral arms swept out as one of the golden-armored men roared in rage, "This brat is a traitor, there's no way to control him. I will delay him, the rest of you join forces to summon the Golden Armor King to kill him." As the sound of his voice faded, a long spear erupted forth, slamming into the astral arms. Boundless golden light radiated from his body, and it felt as though his body was on the verge of shattering, yet he stubbornly endured it. At the same time, the other golden-armored men also shot out their spears, directly blasting into the statue. Boom! A crisp sound rang out from the statue, as though the outer shell of the statue had shattered. Gradually, rays of golden light flashed, and Qin Wendian discovered that this statue was also a golden-armored man, but the size of this one was much larger. Puppet. Qin Wendian could tell with a single glance that this golden-armored man was different from the 9 golden-armored men. The 9 golden-armored men had a cultivation base, and weren't puppets. But the golden-armored giant before him was a true puppet. That golden armor seemed to be forged from gold, and was filled with a terrifying might. Chi, chi, chi. The bodies of the golden-armored men all exploded at the same time, seeking their own deaths. After which, golden motes of light shot out from their bodies and shot towards the golden-armored giant, drilling into its body. Ha, since you don't want to acknowledge the inheritance, just die then. The golden-armored man howled in joy as Qin Wendian crushed him. After which, the golden-armored man's body also exploded, and the golden motes of light drilled into the golden-armored giant's body. Instantly, the golden-armored giant opened its eyes and stood up, placing the 2 ancient scrolls on the ground. Its eyes were filled with boundless killing intent as it stared at Qin Wendian. Boom! The golden-armored giant stepped out, causing the earth to tremble. This caused Qin Wendian's eyes to gleam with sharpness. The 9 golden-armored men weren't puppets, they were humans. And as for this statue, everyone thought that it was the inheritance left behind by an ascendant who had fallen here. Who would have thought that the statue was actually a puppet? Such a scene couldn't help but cause people to ponder. Qin Wendian stared at the golden-armored giant, as though he wanted to see through it completely. In this training ground where only Yuanfu cultivators could enter, a 4th-ranked puppet was indeed an invincible existence. Bzzz. The golden-armored giant flicked a finger at Qin Wendian. As the finger landed, the space around it seemed to distort as a terrifying amount of heavenly energy congregated around it, causing a beam of golden light to appear, capable of penetrating through everything. Qin Wendian's countenance changed. The astral arm instantly appeared in front of him as he blasted out a terrifying palm strike. The 2 attacks collided, causing the great hall to tremble unceasingly. Boundless amounts of divine inscriptions surged forth, blasting towards the golden-armored giant as the astral arm also smashed out. However, the golden-armored giant wasn't afraid at all. He continued advancing, and with a wave of his hand, he ruthlessly collided with the astral arm. Boom! The astral arm directly grabbed the palms of the golden-armored giant, refusing to let go. Qin Wendian's silhouette whistled through the air, as fast as lightning, as he dashed towards the golden-armored giant. The eyes of the golden-armored giant were fixated on Qin Wendian. It was akin to a bolt of golden lightning, wanting to penetrate Qin Wendian's head. Qin Wendian only felt a piercing pain in the center of his brows. Similarly, a terrifying light erupted forth from the center of his brows, colliding with the gaze of the golden-armored giant. Qin Wendian's palms were placed on the golden-armored giant's body as a cold smile appeared on his face. A 4th-ranked puppet could flaunt its might? Qin Wendian blasted out with his palms, only to see an expression of disdain flickering in the eyes of the golden-armored giant. A mere 3rd-level Yuanfu cultivator wanted to shake a 4th-ranked puppet? Was this a dream? Shatter the void. Qin Wendian blasted out with his palms, directly slamming into the head of the puppet. Instantly, a surge of energy gushed into the mind of the puppet, causing its eyes to change color. A surge of energy was destroying its defensive divine inscriptions. How was this possible? Qin Wendian could see through its divine inscriptions. The defensive divine rune on his head was the most well hidden, so how could it be broken? Divine inscriptions were completely inscribed. Even if a divine inscriptionist's perception was strong enough to see it, how difficult would it be to decipher it? However, as Qin Wendian slammed his palm down, it clearly discovered that the defensive divine runes in its head were disintegrating. How high was Qin Wentian's attainments in the Tao of divine inscriptions? Right now, his perception was even more terrifying than before. It was as though he could see through the divine inscriptions of his opponent. How difficult would it be for him to decipher them? Qin Wentian's palms struck out continuously, and every strike landed on the giant's head. The golden-armored giant let out a roar, but soon, with a loud thud, the golden-armored giant knelt on the ground. Roar. Roars of unwillingness rang out. You will die a horrible death. The sound of curses rang out, yet Qin Wentian's countenance was as cold as ever. He frenziedly unleashed his attacks until the golden-armored giant became a masterless puppet. Only then did Qin Wentian store it into his interspatial ring. The masterless puppet, from now on, belonged to him. Qin Wentian slowly walked towards the two ancient scrolls. He picked them up, and after which, Qin Wentian opened them, sending his will into one of the ancient scrolls. This ancient scroll contains all the powerful innate techniques I've cultivated, as well as the insights I've gained from comprehending the divine inscriptions. Now, I'll pass them all on to you. An ancient voice drifted into his ears. Qin Wentian sent his will into it, and as expected, he saw many powerful innate techniques. Qin Wentian laughed. He sent his will into the other scroll, only to hear a voice reverberating in his mind. This lord is the gold element celestial. When I was young, my path was filled with hardships. After that, I obtained a heaven-defying cultivation technique, the gold element ancient scroll, and cultivated an indestructible golden body. My entire body was akin to a divine weapon, and from then on, I roamed unhindered in Grand Xia, sweeping through all the experts. This lord was harmed by my enemies, and passed away in meditation. I left behind my inheritance, imparting everything I've cultivated in my entire life to my descendants. If there's someone who is fated to pass the test and receive my inheritance, you must cultivate it well. Remember 3 things. Firstly, this cultivation technique is heaven-defying, and must never be made known to others, including the elders of the sect. If not, calamity would surely befall this lord. Secondly, this cultivation technique is incomparably tyrannical, and when cultivating it, one would encounter many abnormalities, and only those with great determination would be able to cultivate it. Thirdly, you must never let anyone know that you're cultivating this cultivation technique. If my enemies learn of it, you'll die without a doubt. But of course, if one day you have some accomplishments and step into the celestial phenomenon realm, you'll definitely be able to find out who my enemies are. If you have the heart, avenge this lord. The voice faded away, dissipating into nothingness. Qin Wentian's eyes flickered with an intense sharpness. The gold element ancient scroll, a heaven-defying cultivation technique? Cultivating it without letting others know of it. A cold light flashed in Qin Wentian's eyes. He thought of the 9 golden-armored guardians. They weren't puppets, but humans. Little brother Qin, congratulations on obtaining the Ascendant's inheritance. Old Li laughed. He, Bailu Jing and Bailu Yi remained in the Great Hall. Qin Wentian smiled at Old Li. After which, he walked to the entrance of the Great Hall and stared at the crowd as he spoke. The disputes in the secret realm are all for the sake of obtaining the inheritance. Now that I've obtained it, I'm sure all of you want to kill me. I, Qin, don't wish to be invincible in the entire moon continent. I'm willing to forsake the Ascendant's inheritance and bestow it to all of you. After speaking, Qin Wentian flicked his palms, tossing the ancient scroll out of the Great Hall, causing the crowd to be dumbfounded. Ascendant's inheritance? Qin Wentian had discarded it like a pair of worn-out shoes. Chapter 273. This inheritance, Qin Wentian had no choice but to give it up. The 9 golden-armored cultivators resembled puppets, yet they were in the form of humans. If it wasn't for the fact that Qin Wentian had opened his third eye, he would have been deceived by the golden-armored cultivators, thinking that they were puppets. 9 stellar martial cultivators didn't release their astral souls, yet they cultivated the same type of energy. Indeed, they resembled puppets. However, after Qin Wentian looked at the gold punishment ancient scroll, a thought popped up in his head. Could it be that these 9 golden-armored cultivators also cultivated the inheritance? As for the message left behind, it also caused Qin Wentian to feel suspicious. The golden-armored cultivator mentioned that this cultivation art was tyrannical, and that there would be abnormalities when cultivating it. He even warned Qin Wentian not to let his elders know about this, causing him to feel that something was wrong. Even though the golden-armored cultivator pointed out that he was killed by someone close to him, Qin Wentian still had his suspicions. Since they were looking for someone to inherit the inheritance, why were only Yuanfu cultivators able to enter, and Heavenly Dipper sovereigns couldn't? Since Heavenly Dipper sovereigns couldn't enter, it could be explained that the inheritance only depended on one's talent. But why did the golden-armored cultivator say that his cultivation base was too low, and he wasn't worthy of the inheritance? Not only that, although his cultivation base wasn't high, he knew that he had an extraordinary background. Not to mention that he had obtained multiple cultivation arts from the Azure Emperor. Hence, he didn't place much importance on this cultivation art. No matter how heaven-defying the golden-armored cultivator's words were, his heart wouldn't waver. Qin Wentian's personality was extremely decisive. Since he had suspicions, and it wasn't a cultivation art that he needed, he would directly give it up. His heart didn't waver in the slightest. He didn't even leave it behind for Bailu Jing and Bailu Yi. He felt that there might be a problem with the inheritance. Qin Wentian stared at the people outside the Great Hall. None of them moved, and their eyes gleamed with sharpness as they stared at the ancient scroll. Evidently, none of them had expected Qin Wentian to do this. Even Bailu Yi and the rest turned pale. It wasn't easy for them to obtain this inheritance, and they actually wanted to give it away. Glancing at the people standing outside, Zhan Chen, Yang Fan, Zhao Lai, and Hua Feng, the powers behind these people could indeed represent the entire Moon continent. If Qin Wentian became enemies with them, Qin Wentian would no longer be able to establish a foothold in the Moon continent. In fact, it might even affect her White Deer Institute. That ancient scroll contains the inheritance art of the Gold Element Ascendant. Now, I'll give it up and give it to all of you. As for the ancient scroll in my hand, it contains the inheritance of the Tao of divine inscriptions and formations. It's exactly what I need. I, Qin, will keep it for myself. In that case, I won't let down all of you. Let's forget about the enmity between us after we exit this place. Naturally, if all of you still refuse to give up and come looking for trouble with me, I, Qin, will definitely kill all of you. Qin Wentian's voice rumbled like thunder, filled with magnanimity. Although he said it this way, Qin Wentian understood in his heart that the enmity between them wouldn't be resolved so easily. Not to mention that Zhan Chen, he had already exposed his secret, how could Zhan Chen spare him? But now, he had already said that he wasn't willing to become the target of public criticism. At the very least, if he gave up the inheritance art, would these heavens chosen from the transcendent powers have the face to use the elders of their respective clans or sects to deal with him? After speaking, Qin Wentian flicked his sleeves as rumbling sounds echoed out. Momentarily, the doors of the Great Hall slowly closed, no longer bothering with the matters of the outside world. Outside, the eyes of the crowd gleamed with sharpness as they stared at the ancient scroll. So it turned out that this was the inheritance art left behind by the Gold Element Ascendant. This cultivation art, I want it. Only to see that Zhao Lai was the first to step out. A blazing saber appeared in his hands, flickering with a terrifying fiery light, exuding a terrifying heat. His silhouette dashed out, directly aiming for the ancient scroll. As soon as he moved, the others also moved. Yang Fan stretched out his palms as the star-seizing palm imprint whistled out. A gigantic palm appeared in the air, grabbing towards the ancient scroll. Stay here. Zhao Lai's saber flashed with a brilliant light, as though space itself was about to be sliced apart by him. And at this instant, Zhan Chen and Hua Feng also moved, their silhouettes dashing towards the ancient scroll. Since Qin Wentian had explained everything clearly, there was no doubt that this ancient scroll was an inheritance art. If not, if Qin Wentian wanted to cheat them and one of them showed the scroll to the others, they would know that they had been cheated by Qin Wentian. If that was the case, Qin Wentian would have offended them even more. Since that was the case, they might as well not hand over the ancient scroll. Hence, there was an 80% chance that this cultivation art was real. However, at this moment, the entire space started to tremble. The golden-armored male had said that if the inheritance was obtained by someone else, this place would collapse. In the air, the statue also trembled, and with a deafening boom, it directly exploded into pieces. In that instant, the entire space was swept up by a powerful gust of wind. This training ground was on the verge of collapse. The great hall that Qin Wentian was in was also trembling. Bai Lu-yi inclined her head, staring at the trembling great hall as she asked, "What should we do?" "Let's go." Qin Wentian spoke, as he flew in the opposite direction of the exit, directly blasting a hole in the great hall. Their group flickered as they sped away. The gust of wind grew stronger and stronger, and it was as though a sandstorm was sweeping over them. "This space is already collapsing, but it shouldn't be a threat to our lives." Bai Lu Jing shouted in the midst of the sandstorm, wanting to pull Bai Lu-yi back, only to discover that the sandstorm was blowing into their eyes, causing them to be unable to open their eyes at all. Qin Wentian closed his eyes, using his perception to probe his surroundings. Abruptly, his heart trembled. "This is bad," Qin Wentian mumbled. Up in the air, it was as though a desert had swept over them, directly burying them. Their bodies moved along with the flow of the sand, and in an instant, they had no idea where they were swept to. The four of them were completely separated from each other. 3 days later, news circulated that the training ground for divine inscriptions had disappeared. The ancient city had been buried by the sandstorm. At the original location of the ancient city, there were several people gathered there, staring at the ruins of the ancient city, yet they couldn't see anything else. There was only a vast expanse of golden sand. What happened? The hearts of the crowd were filled with curiosity. It was rumored that the training ground for divine inscriptions was the Tao cultivation ground of an ascendant, and there was a high possibility that the inheritance of the ascendant could be found there. If that was the case, why would such a situation occur? Where was the training ground? And who had obtained the inheritance of the ascendant? The news gradually circulated around the moon continent, causing more and more people to gather here out of curiosity. Even those from the major powers had arrived, but at this moment, there was also news that the number 11 ranker of the Heavenly Fate rankings, Zhan Chen, had already returned to the Pill Emperor Hall. After which, Yang Fan from the Star-Seizing Manor, Zhao Lai from the Skyember sect, and Hua Feng from the Hua clan all returned to their respective clans and sections. And after that, there was also news that the inheritance of the Ascendant had been obtained by Zhan Chen from the Pill Emperor Hall. Many people sighed in their hearts. Zhan Chen was indeed worthy of being ranked number 11 on the Heavenly Fate rankings, the strongest participant in the training ground. Now that he had obtained the inheritance of the Ascendant, Zhan Chen's status in the Pill Emperor Hall would definitely be even higher than before. As for what exactly happened in the training ground, and why so many experts had fallen, nobody knew. But one could imagine that the training ground this time around must have been extremely intense. Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu-yi also returned to the White Deer Institute. Bai Lu-yi snorted disdainfully when she heard the rumors circulating in the outside world. Among all the rumors, only Qin Wentian's name wasn't mentioned. Most probably, the news of the heavens chosen from the transcendent powers being chased out of the Great Inheritance Hall was something that no one dared to mention. Each and every heavens chosen had to rely on a grandmaster at the 3rd level of Yuanfu in order to enter the Great Inheritance Hall. And after that, they were actually chased out of the Ascendant's Great Inheritance Hall. Even the final part of the inheritance was given to Zhan Chen by a grandmaster at the 3rd level of Yuanfu. Because of this, Zhan Chen was even injured. These matters were only known by those who were directly involved in the matter. The truth might be buried in the sands of time. Because even if Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu-yi did it for the sake of Qin Wentian, they wouldn't publicize this matter. Although this would allow Qin Wentian's name to resound throughout the entire moon continent, at the same time, it would also push Qin Wentian to the teeth of the storm, becoming the target of public criticism. Don't forget, even if he gave up the inheritance, he still had another ancient tome of divine inscriptions. To grandmasters, the value of the tome left behind by the ascendant was even more valuable compared to the cultivation art. But now, where was Qin Wentian? Bai Lui stood at the top of the pavilion, gazing into the horizons. In the ruins of the refinement grounds, beneath the billowing yellow sands, a dilapidated palace could be seen. Qin Wentian sat cross-legged inside, with a puppet in front of him. This puppet was none other than the golden-armored king puppet. Qin Wentian naturally knew how to refine puppets. Now that this puppet had no master, how could he waste it? After all, this was a fourth-ranked puppet. In Qin Wentian's eyes, a puppet was a divine weapon. Refining a puppet was the same as refining a divine weapon. After a divine weapon was refined, it could be controlled by one's will. If it was a divine weapon, one could use their will to control the sword, killing enemies from 1,000 miles away. And after refining a puppet, it would also be controlled by the will of its master, unless the will of the puppet was forcefully erased by an expert from the outside. Hence, Qin Wentian first repaired the defensive divine inscriptions of the puppet. In addition, the material used to refine this puppet had an extremely high defense. Unless it was attacked by a heavenly dipper sovereign, it would be extremely difficult to erase the defensive divine inscriptions. After all, it wasn't easy to find someone like him who could defend against the reverse divine inscriptions. After a long period of time, the golden-armored king puppet stood up. Its eyes abruptly flashed with a golden light, as though it was a golden sword, capable of piercing through the eyes of those who looked at it. A faint smile flickered in Qin Wentian's eyes. With an intention of his will, he kept the puppet into his interspatial ring. Since this puppet was controlled by his will, he could naturally keep it in his interspatial ring. But if it was controlled by someone else, he would have to erase that person's will before he could keep it. After refining the puppet, Qin Wentian wasn't in a hurry to leave. He closed his eyes and started to carefully sense the changes in his body. After closing his eyes, a ray of light shot out from the center of his brows. After which, a golden vertical eye appeared there. When this eye opened, everything in the outside world was imprinted into his mind, and at the same time, it was imprinted into his heart. In that instant, Qin Wentian's heart trembled. Both of his eyes opened, and at the same time, a resplendent beam of golden light shot out from them. The beam of light swept past, penetrating through the hearts of others. There seemed to be a mandate emanating from his eyes. His eyes could actually release the willpower that he had comprehended. Chapter 274. After the incident at the secret grounds of divine inscriptions, the transcendent powers of the moon continent once again returned to their former transcendent powers. Not only that, the level of danger at the secret grounds of divine inscriptions this time around far surpassed all the previous ones. Within the secret grounds of divine inscriptions, many of the transcendent powers had fallen. According to those who survived, they only managed to walk out alive after the secret grounds of divine inscriptions had been destroyed. If not, they would have been trapped there forever. Undoubtedly, the Pale Emperor Hall had become the victor in the eyes of the crowd. Because only Zhan Chen, the chosen of the Pale Emperor Hall, had obtained the legendary inheritance of the Ascendant. This was a topic of discussion for countless people. Zhan Chen was originally ranked number 11 on the Heavenly Fate rankings, and was only one rank away from entering the top 10. After receiving the inheritance this time around, the Pale Emperor Hall had placed even more importance on him. Many people were speculating when Zhan Chen would attempt to enter the top 10 of the Heavenly Fate rankings. To Zhan Chen, the difference of a single rank was extremely important. The meaning behind the top 10 and the top 11 was completely different. In the Pale Emperor Hall, Zhan Chen didn't seem to be excited at all. In fact, there was even a hint of sorrow on his face. Zhan Chen, since your fate is already determined, don't be sad. Everything will be gone with the wind. At this moment, Zhan Chen's master consoled him. However, Qing Yu's death was all because of my incompetence, I failed to protect her. Zhan Chen sighed. After which, a cold sword light erupted forth from his eyes. Qin Yu's death, half of the responsibility lies with that Grandmaster Divine Inscriptionist. If it weren't for him, Qin Yu wouldn't have died in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions. I will personally kill that person, a debt of blood must be paid in blood. The killing intent in Zhan Chen's eyes wasn't fake at all. That was the killing intent he had towards Qin Wentian, an extremely intense killing intent. He originally wanted Qin Wentian to die. Not to mention the fact that Qin Wentian had witnessed his secret. Qin Wentian had severely injured him in the Great Hall of the trial grounds and thrown him out of the Great Hall. In the end, Qin Wentian had abandoned the legacy book and given it to them. Qin Wentian deserved to die. Abandon, the item Qin Wentian had abandoned, he had to sacrifice half his life before he could snatch it away. Eventually, he returned to the Pill Emperor Hall safely. How could Qin Wentian not die? Since you have the heart, you will personally avenge Qin Yue. Kill this brat. Zhan Chen, as a heaven's chosen of the Pill Emperor Hall, there was naturally no need for him to worry too much about matters of revenge. Zhan Chen would definitely be able to accomplish it. Master, Martial Uncle, I still have matters to attend to, so I'll take my leave first. At this moment, a beautiful maiden beside them spoke, causing Zhan Chen's gaze to land on her. Mo Qingcheng, under the tutelage of her martial uncle, Luo He, had improved by leaps and bounds, regardless of cultivation or alchemy. Not only that, Mo Qingcheng's martial uncle wouldn't be stingy in the slightest, as long as it was beneficial to her cultivation. Okay, you can leave first, Zhan Chen will send you off. Luo He nodded her head lightly. No need, Senior Zhan Chen still needs to cultivate, there's no need to waste time. Mo Qingcheng's voice was as cold as ever, as cold as ever. After speaking, she bowed slightly to Luo He before departing alone. Bai Fei, who was following beside Mo Qingcheng, cast a deep glance at Zhan Chen, her beautiful eyes flickering with a hint of emotion. Zhan Chen, the most outstanding young man in the Pill Emperor Hall below the Heavenly Dipper realm. He was always so cultured and elegant, approachable and approachable. However, Bai Fei knew that it was impossible for her and Zhan Chen to be together. In her eyes, Zhan Chen was a lofty and lofty existence, unreachable. In the past, there was Qin Yu, and now, there was Mo Qingcheng. Bai Fei sighed in her heart as she chased after Mo Qingcheng. Not long after, she caught up to her. Staring at the cold and beautiful back view of Mo Qingcheng, Bai Fei's beautiful eyes flickered. Her lips moved, as though she wanted to say something, but in the end, no words came out. She knew that the divine inscriptionist Zhan Chen was referring to was none other than Qin Wentian. Zhan Chen wanted to kill Qin Wentian. If she were to tell Mo Qingcheng that Qin Wentian had come to the moon continent, and had even entered the refinement grounds, how would Mo Qingcheng react? However, she chose to remain silent. If Senior Zhan Chen killed Qin Wentian, wouldn't that mean that there would no longer be any possibility between him and Mo Qingcheng? In the White Deer Institute, atop a pavilion, Bai Lui stared at the lake water in front of her, her heart filled with worry. A month had already passed, but Qin Wentian had yet to return. She was worried that Qin Wentian would be in danger. You're thinking about that fellow again. At this moment, a low laughter drifted over. Bai Lui turned her gaze over, rolling her eyes at her brother as she asked, "What are you talking about? You still don't want to admit it? During these few days, you haven't been to the White Deer Cavern, and you haven't even cultivated." Bai Lu Jing stared at his sister as he laughed. Even if your brother disappeared for a year and a half, you wouldn't be so worried. You're so powerful, what could possibly happen to you? Bai Lui laughed, his cultivation base isn't high after all. Although he gave up on the inheritance scroll, if he really encountered those fellows, they would definitely not spare him. Are you that unconfident in him? Bai Lu Jing laughed, you're too worried. You're right, that fellow has so many methods up his sleeves. Even if they wanted to kill him, it wouldn't be so easy. A relaxed smile appeared on Bai Lu Yi's face. Although she hadn't interacted with Qin Wentian for a long time, and his cultivation base was only at the 3rd level of Yuanfu, that fellow had a unique charisma that caused people to feel that he was extraordinary. It wouldn't be so easy to deal with him. Zhan Chen, Yang Fan, Zhao Lai and the rest were all heaven's chosen, but when they fought for the inheritance, they were all chased out of the Great Hall by him. But now, our White Deer Institute is in trouble. A loathsome fellow has appeared, Bailu Jing stated in a depressed tone, causing Bailu Yi to be stunned. What happened to the White Deer Institute? You should still remember what the elders said about the White Deer Institute, right? Bailu Jing asked, his words causing Bailu Yi's heart to tremble. Of course she knew, she had even discussed this matter with Qin Wentian back in the training grounds. Qin Wentian had the Azure Emperor token in his hands, he was a descendant of the Azure Emperor. Of course, Bailu Yi replied. A descendant from the D clan of the Azure Emperor has arrived, announcing that he wants to take over the White Deer Institute, Bailu Jing stated, his words causing Bailu Jing's beautiful eyes to freeze. The D clan of the Azure Emperor had arrived? Not only that, they wanted to take over the White Deer Institute. How could this be possible? What about Qin Wentian? Qin Wentian was the possessor of the Azure Emperor's token. Not only that, other than the possessor of the Azure Emperor's token, who else would know of the hidden Azure faction? Bailu Yi suddenly felt that this matter wasn't as simple as it seemed. When did he arrive? Bailu Yi asked. Today. Not only that, he seems to be very clear about the current situation of our White Deer Institute. He even knows about you. A helpless smile could be seen on Bailu Jing's face. With regards to the Azure faction, it was just as Qin Wentian had guessed. Although they still followed the teachings of their ancestors, their feelings for the Azure faction had already faded. Especially so for the younger generation, which of them didn't have any feelings for the Azure faction? He knows about me. Bailu Yi was dumbfounded. That fellow is extremely arrogant. The moment he arrived, he said that he wanted the entire White Deer Institute to listen to his commands. He said that he would take control of the White Deer Institute, and in order to compensate us, he would marry you. Bailu Jing laughed speechlessly. He already had no feelings for the Azure faction, and now that he saw such a ridiculous person, how could he have any good feelings? He only felt that it was ridiculous. Let's go take a look. Bailu Yi spoke, following Bailu Jing as they left the area, arriving at a courtyard in the White Deer Institute. There were several people gathered here, and the person in the lead wasn't an elder of the White Deer Institute. Instead, it was a young man clad in a long golden robe, exuding an aura of nobility. His countenance was filled with a faint trace of arrogance. Behind the young man, there was an old man quietly standing there, as though he didn't exist. However, it was precisely because of this that this old man was extraordinary. Upon seeing Bailu Yi walking over, the young man's gaze swept over her. Her angelic countenance, fiery figure, she gave off an intense feeling of desire. The young man's eyes abruptly brightened as he laughed. You must be Little Yi. Little Yi? Bailu Yi was dumbfounded, staring at the young man speechlessly. Even with their relationship, Qin Wentian had never referred to her in such a manner. This was the first time they met, yet this young man referred to her as Little Yi. Who might you be? Bailu Yi asked. Di Cheng, I'm a direct descendant of the Azure faction, a direct descendant of the Azure Emperor. The young man's voice contained hints of arrogance. Bailu Yi stared at him as she asked, Do you have the Azure Emperor token? This manor was located in the central region of the White Deer Institute, and the security here was extremely tight. Only core members of the institute were allowed to enter, hence Bailu Yi didn't need to worry about her words leaking out. The Azure Emperor token is temporarily not in my hands, Di Cheng replied. He didn't expect Bailu Yi to directly ask about the Azure Emperor token. Since you don't have the Azure Emperor token, how can you talk about the inheritance of the D clan? Bailu Yi coldly replied. The Azure Emperor token is the symbol of the successor of the Azure Emperor. Bailu Yi heaved a sigh of relief upon seeing that Di Cheng was unable to take out the Azure Emperor token. Although she trusted Qin Wentian completely, the secret of the Azure faction wasn't known by many. She was afraid that if the young man could take out the Azure Emperor token, it would mean that Qin Wentian had lied to her. However, Di Cheng was unable to take out the Azure Emperor token. This indicated that the identity of the successor was extremely suspicious. Hee hee. Di Cheng laughed. The Azure faction has experienced too many trials and tribulations up till now. The Azure Emperor token has yet to be found, but the Azure faction can no longer remain silent. I came here with the identity of a descendant of the Di clan, hoping that the White Deer Institute will follow the teachings of our ancestors and assist me in reviving the Azure faction. Just because you say you are, it means you are. Bailu Yi bluntly replied. The hidden Azure faction has been hidden for many years, only those with the Azure Emperor token would know of it. How did you know about the White Deer Institute? Chapter 275. Back then, the Azure Emperor Palace was one of the strongest powers in Grand Xia, with experts as common as the clouds. Among them, not everyone had the surname Di. There were disciples, successors, and even loyal protectors and servants of the Azure Emperor. Together, they formed the Azure faction. After the destruction of the Azure Emperor Palace, those who were most loyal to the Azure Emperor silently left, concealing themselves in various locations in Grand Xia, concealing their identities and even changing their original surnames. However, they all had a single mission. If one day, there would be a person who could control the Azure Emperor Palace, that person would be the leader of the hidden factions of the Azure Emperor, allowing the Azure Emperor Palace to rise up once again. This was also the teachings of the White Deer Institute. But this wait was simply too long. For thousands of years, such a person had yet to appear. The inheritances of the hidden bloodlines grew longer and longer, and their loyalty to the Azure Emperor naturally grew weaker and weaker. Right now, the only thing binding them was the teachings of their ancestors. Since there was the Azure Emperor token, there would naturally be a person in charge of it. This person was none other than the Azure Emperor's foster son, as well as his personal disciple. He took after the Azure Emperor's surname, and his bloodline was the most direct line of descent. The mission of selecting a successor for the Azure Emperor also fell onto the shoulders of this bloodline. Maybe, this bloodline was the most loyal to the Azure Emperor. The person behind Di Cheng couldn't help but to berate, impudent. This person had been silent all this while, as though he didn't exist. But now that he had spoken, his tone was extremely imposing. Di Cheng laughed as he waved his hands. Little E is still young, there's no need to worry about it. Since you want to hear the truth, I'll tell you. Currently, the person in charge of the Azure Emperor token has been captured by the 9 Mystical Palace, and there's a possibility that they will force out the Azure Emperor token. At that time, all the hidden factions would be exposed, and the only thing waiting for you all would be destruction. This old man has also heard that only the person in charge of the Azure Emperor token would know of our whereabouts. Since you guys don't have the Azure Emperor token, how would you know? Can I understand that you have already gone against the teachings of your ancestors? At this moment, an elder from the White Deer Institute spoke. Although his tone was calm, his words were filled with sharpness and sharpness. I'll explain this to you later. Di Cheng smiled as he continued, the White Deer Institute is the first hidden faction I want to unify. I will definitely not mistreat the White Deer Institute. In the future, Little E will be my wife, and the White Deer Institute will become the leader of the Azure faction. Who said I want to be your wife? Bailu Yizhen didn't expect Qin Wentian to be so shameless, acting as though he was doing her a favor. Di Cheng's eyes brightened as he watched Qin Wentian's actions. Let's not talk about this matter for now. Young Master Di Cheng, why don't you take a rest first? An elder spoke calmly, not wanting to continue the conversation. Knowing that it was impossible to take down the White Deer Institute in one go, Di Cheng nodded in agreement. After making arrangements for Di Cheng, the White Deer Institute naturally couldn't avoid a discussion. Most of the core members of White Deer Academy were gathered within the hall. The 4 patriarchs, 9 elders, the masters of the various halls, and the outstanding juniors of the direct line of descent were gathered here. The person in the lead was none other than Bai Lu Yi's great-grandfather, the current administrator of the White Deer Institute. This old man had white hair and a white beard, but he still had the spirit of a dragon and a tiger. "What's your attitude towards this matter?" the old man calmly stated. "I don't agree. Our White Deer Institute is already a branch of power, why should we be controlled by others? Not only that, this person isn't even able to take out the Azure Emperor token." An elder from the White Deer Institute coldly stated. "This matter needs to be discussed at length. After all, the ancestral teachings are still there. But the identity of this person is still worth investigating. I'll listen to elder brother." The last elder tapped on the armrest of his chair as he added, "Let's seek the opinions of the juniors." Bai Lu Yi quietly observed the attitudes of the crowd. What made her surprised was that her great-grandfather and the other elders didn't seem to agree with the idea. Not to mention the juniors, the majority of them didn't seem to agree. Thinking of Qin Wentian, Bai Lu Yi couldn't help but smile bitterly. It seemed like that fellow's path wouldn't be so smooth. "Little Yi, what's your opinion?" an elder asked Bai Lu Yi. This elder was none other than her grandfather. Bai Lu Yi pondered for a moment before replying, "I don't know what the other elders think about the current White Deer Institute. Do you wish for the White Deer Institute to remain like this, hiding within the Moon continent, or do you wish for the Azure Emperor Palace to be able to stand tall in Grand Xia one day? If it's the former, there's no need for us to discuss this further." The various elders froze for a moment before smiles appeared on their faces. "We're already old, we can't even compare to Little Yi's words." Bai Lu Yi's great-grandfather laughed. "That's right. First of all, what's our attitude? If there's someone who can allow us to stand tall in Grand Xia with the identity of the Azure Emperor Palace, this means that the strength of the Azure Emperor Palace wouldn't lose out to any of the major powers in Grand Xia." "I have no objections," an elder stated. Bai Lu Yi discovered that the majority of those who wished for the White Deer Institute to stand tall in Grand Xia with the identity of the Azure Emperor Palace. Only those who were more conservative still wished for the White Deer Institute to remain like this. "Little Yi, you heard it yourself. Continue with your thoughts." Bai Lu Yi's great-grandfather looked at her as a gentle smile appeared on his face. "Great-grandfather, it seems that everyone is unwilling to accept the current status of the White Deer Institute." Bai Lu Yi smiled. "Ultimately, the Grand Xia Empire belongs to the transcendent powers. Although the White Deer Institute is extraordinary, the 4 transcendent powers of the Moon continent are still able to suppress us," the old man stated. Since we're unwilling, let's find an opportunity." Bai Lu Yi nodded. "You agree to submit to Di Cheng?" the white-bearded old man asked in bewilderment. "No, I believe that the successor of the Azure Emperor, as well as the one with the Azure Emperor token, would definitely be someone extraordinary." A sweet smile appeared on Bai Lu Yi's face, as a bright light flickered in her eyes. Di Cheng's appearance might not be a bad thing for Qin Wentian. At the very least, Di Cheng had shaken the peace of the White Deer Institute, causing them to have to weigh the pros and cons in their hearts. The white-bearded old man stared at Bai Lu Yi in bewilderment. Why was this last so confident in the successor of the Azure Emperor? However, Di Cheng said that the person in charge of the Azure Emperor token has been captured by the 9 Mystical Palace. In the future, the Azure Emperor token would fall into someone else's hands. "Great-grandfather, do you believe his words?" Bai Lu Yi asked, her words causing the old man to smile as he nodded, "I don't." "All right, all of you can leave now. Remember, do not mention anything about the Azure faction to outsiders. If not, don't blame the clan for treating you coldly." The old man's voice was filled with authority. This matter was too serious. If news of it leaked out, the White Deer Institute would be in grave danger. The people here were all core members of the White Deer Institute, yet he still reminded them, worried that they wouldn't be able to keep their mouths shut. Bai Lu Yi and the rest departed. After that, although the people of the White Deer Institute were as warm to Di Cheng as before, they only feigned civility. They believed that Di Cheng might really be a descendant of the Di clan, or else he wouldn't have known so many secrets. However, Di Cheng could also tell that although the people of the White Deer Institute were warm and courteous to him, they didn't have the slightest intention of supporting him. In fact, he couldn't even meet with the elders of the White Deer Institute. However, the skin of this Di Cheng was truly thick enough. He continued to stay in the White Deer Institute, pestering Bai Lu Yi from time to time. This caused the people of the White Deer Institute to suspect that even if Di Cheng was a descendant of the Di clan, would the Di clan really dare to entrust their future to such a pompous character? Until one day, another young man arrived at the White Deer Institute. Only then did the White Deer Institute realize that they were wrong. This young man was named Di Feng. This young man was completely different from the pompous Di Cheng. He was calm and steady, and although his age wasn't too far apart from Di Cheng, he exuded an air of leadership, exuding an extraordinary aura. Not only that, the strength of this young man far surpassed Di Cheng. After his arrival, Di Cheng no longer dared to claim that he was the successor of the Di clan. This made the people of the White Deer Institute understand. Di Cheng was merely a scout, while Di Feng was the true successor of the Di clan. After comparing Di Feng and Di Cheng, the people of the White Deer Institute suddenly felt that Di Feng was too outstanding. Maybe, he could really lead the entire Azure faction. In the training grounds of the White Deer Institute, there were many spectators watching the two young men on the stage. These two were none other than Di Feng and Bai Lu Jing. Bai Lu Jing was at a disadvantage under Di Feng's attacks, retreating continuously. His eyes gleamed with sharpness as he stared at the young man in front of him. You should have another name, right? Di Feng flicked his sleeves as he smiled at Bai Lu Jing. Brother Jing's strength is extraordinary. I'm sure you'll be able to advance a few ranks in the Heavenly Fate rankings. I do indeed have another name, Emperor Azure. Emperor Azure, Emperor Azure. Bai Lu Jing murmured as he laughed, so it's you. Only today did I finally understand the true meaning behind the name Emperor Azure. The old men by the side also had their eyes gleaming with sharpness. This young man was none other than Emperor Azure. Emperor Azure. Bai Lu Yi also had a look of shock on her face. The person ranked number 5 on the Heavenly Fate rankings was none other than Emperor Azure. Emperor Azure, ranked number 5 on the Heavenly Fate rankings, his name shook Grand Xia. However, how many people knew that his real name was Di Feng? Emperor Azure, Azure Emperor. So that's how it is, Bai Lu Yi's grandfather murmured. He also understood the meaning behind this name. However, even such a character like Emperor Azure hadn't obtained the Azure Emperor's inheritance or the Azure Emperor token. In truth, this was also one of Di Feng's regrets. It wasn't that he didn't have the ability, it was because of the environment he grew up in. From a young age, he was brought away by his master to roam the world, and when he returned, he was already at Yuanfu. However, Di Feng didn't care. Even if he didn't obtain the Azure Emperor token, he would still lead the Azure faction. Little Yi, do you think this young man can lead the Azure faction back to glory? Bai Lu Yi's grandfather smiled, causing Bai Lu Yi to be stunned. She suddenly had a thought. The people of the Di clan were too smart. First, they sent Di Cheng here, causing the White Deer Institute to have an extremely bad impression of him. After that, they sent the number 5 ranker, Di Feng, to appear. With such a contrast, it was very easy for people to acknowledge Di Feng. Bai Lu Yi didn't know how to reply, but at this moment, a figure walked over from afar. Miss Yi, Qin Wentian has returned. Bai Lu Yi's beautiful eyes froze for a moment before a smile appeared on her face. That fellow had finally returned. Chapter 276. After Qin Wentian obtained the ancient manual, he immersed himself in comprehending it. At the same time, he sensed the transformations in his body. This closed-door seclusion lasted for a total of 2 months, causing him to lose track of time. In these 2 months, he deeply felt the power of his bloodline. At the same time, he also experienced the profoundness of the ancient manual left behind by the Gold Element Celestial Lord. The Gold Element Celestial was truly an extraordinary character. Regardless of his attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions or his cultivation base, he was extremely powerful. In fact, Qin Wendian was thinking that although the other inheritance he left behind had been discarded by him, it should still be extremely powerful. However, Qin Wendian had no regrets. He believed in his intuition. If it wasn't for the fact that he had opened his third eye and personally witnessed that the golden-armored giants weren't puppets, he wouldn't have doubted the inheritance. But now that he saw the 9 golden-armored giants guarding the inheritance like puppets, and even sacrificing their lives to control the golden-armored giants, Qin Wendian couldn't help but doubt the authenticity of the ancient manual. Hence, he gave up. In these 2 months, his strength had risen by leaps and bounds. Regardless of his attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions, the current him was more and more confident in himself. Most probably, it wouldn't be too long before he would be able to establish a foothold in the Moon continent. He wouldn't be like now, unable to do anything he wanted. This was also the feeling Qin Wendian had after coming to the Moon continent. That sense of urgency caused him to constantly think of ways to increase his strength. In truth, his cultivation base was already outstanding enough. He stepped onto the path of cultivation at the age of 16 and awakened his 3 astral souls, all originating from the 5th heavenly layer. Up until now, he had never met anyone who could match up to him. Stepping into Yuanfu before the age of 18, his name shook the entire Chu country. Not only that, he even managed to determine the ruler of the Chu country. This was an achievement that many would never be able to achieve in their entire lives. And now, he wasn't even 19 yet. His current cultivation base was at the 4th level of Yuanfu. During his closed-door seclusion, he broke through again, stepping into the 4th level of Yuanfu from the 3rd level. His Yuanfu pool grew stronger, and his insights into the Tao of martial Tao grew deeper. Not far away, a beautiful silhouette walked over. Although Bai Luyi wasn't as beautiful as Mo Qingcheng, she gave off a sense of comfort when looking at her. She was clean, refreshing, pure, and sexy. Every time people saw her, their eyes would light up. "You rascal, you still know to come back." Bai Luyi glared coquettishly at Qin Wendian. In front of Qin Wendian, she didn't have to feign coldness anymore. She was more and more casual, occasionally revealing her feminine side, adding to her charm. Qin Wendian stared at Bai Luyi as a smile flashed across his face. "From your tone, why do I feel as though this is my home?" "In your dreams." Bai Luyi glared at him. "How was your harvest this time around?" "I've gained a lot. Do you want to take a look at the Ascendant's ancient scroll?" Qin Wendian stared at Bai Luyi with a teasing look in his eyes. And indeed, upon hearing his words, Bai Luyi's beautiful eyes instantly lit up. The ancient scroll of the Ascendant, to a genius divine inscriptionist, was simply too attractive. If the people of the Moon continent were to learn of this, it would definitely cause many 4th-ranked grandmasters to go crazy over it. "Forget it, you were the one who snatched the inheritance, it should belong to you," Bai Luyi replied after some thought. "I didn't say I would give it to you," Qin Wendian laughed, causing Bai Luyi to glare at him fiercely. Was he joking with her? "I'll lend it to you for a few days, it won't affect my comprehension." Qin Wendian shrugged, causing Bai Luyi's beautiful eyes to freeze. Staring at the teasing look on Qin Wendian's face, she involuntarily punched him in the chest. Qin Wendian naturally wouldn't be stingy with Bai Luyi. This beautiful young lady had used her own body to block an attack from Zhu Sha when they were fighting for the inheritance. "Where's Big Bro Chu Mang and Fatty?" Qin Wendian couldn't help but ask when he saw Little Rascal running over. The two of them are currently in a frenzy, roaming all over the place to temper themselves. During these 2 months, they've already accumulated countless battle achievements in the Hell Arena. Bai Luyi's words caused Qin Wendian's heart to tremble. Fatty finally wasn't lazy anymore. Ling Ning's death must have been a huge blow to him. In the vast Grand Xia Empire, experts were as common as the clouds. If one didn't have enough strength, they could only watch helplessly as the heart-wrenching things happened. If Qin Wendian had his current strength back then, the Leng clan wouldn't have been able to touch a single strand of hair on Leng Ning's head. Yan Tai, whom the Leng clan tried to curry favor with, would be easily killed by the current him. Qin Wendian, come with me, I have something important to tell you. Bai Lu Yi's countenance turned solemn as she brought Qin Wendian to a secret location. However, it wasn't the central region. Although Qin Wendian and Bai Lu Yi had a good relationship, as long as Qin Wendian wasn't a core member of the White Deer Institute, he wouldn't be able to enter that place. Di Feng and Di Cheng were exceptions, because they knew the greatest secret of the White Deer Institute, the Azure faction. Although Qin Wendian also knew about it, before Qin Wendian decided to lay his cards on the table, Bai Lu Yi naturally wouldn't tell the White Deer Institute on his behalf. It was up to Qin Wendian to make the decision himself. What's the matter? Qin Wendian couldn't help but ask when he saw Bai Lu Yi pulling him to a secluded location. These few days, a group of people came to the White Deer Institute. One of them is named Di Feng, and he has another name, Emperor Azure. He's ranked number 5 on the Heavenly Fate rankings and is currently in the training grounds of the White Deer Institute. They are from the Di clan, a direct descendant of the Azure Emperor. Bai Lu Yi's words instantly caused Qin Wendian's countenance to turn heavy. Direct descendant of the Azure Emperor, the Di clan. Qin Wendian instantly thought of the headmaster of the Emperor's Star Academy, D.E. That old man should still be in the 9 Mystical Palace, right? Qin Wendian wondered if the 9 Mystical Palace had managed to kill him. As he thought of this, Qin Wendian's thirst for power grew even more intense. They know that the White Deer Institute is one of the hidden branches of the Azure Emperor. Their purpose in coming here is to gain control of the White Deer Institute and revive the Azure Emperor Palace, Bai Lu Yi stated, her words causing many thoughts to appear in Qin Wendian's heart. After obtaining the Azure Emperor token, he knew that his path to reclaim the Azure faction wouldn't be smooth. Now that the Di clan had appeared, he couldn't help but wonder what their stance would be. If they knew that the Azure Emperor token was in his hands, what would their attitude be? Without the Azure Emperor token, do you think the White Deer Institute would approve of them? Qin Wendian asked in a heavy voice. These people have some tricks up their sleeves. First, they sent the Silk Pants Di Cheng over, causing the White Deer Institute to have a bad impression of him. And after that, Di Feng appeared, causing the elders of the White Deer Institute to have a good impression of Di Feng. If they really saw hope in him, I think the White Deer Institute might really agree to their request. Bai Lu Yi continued, as for their explanation regarding the Azure Emperor token, they said that the protector of the Azure Emperor token had been captured by the 9 Mystical Palace. They were worried that the secret of the Azure faction would be leaked, and this caused the White Deer Institute to change their plans. Qin Wendian contemplated for a moment after hearing Bai Lu Yi's words. This matter was a challenge to him, but at the same time, it was also an opportunity. The people from the Di clan had helped him break through the layers of paper, causing the White Deer Institute to have the intention of reviving the Azure Emperor Palace. Next, the question was who would be in charge of the Azure faction. After Senior DE passed the Azure Emperor token to me, he was captured by the 9 Mystical Palace because of me. I believe that even in death, Senior DE wouldn't divulge the secret of the Azure faction, Qin Wendian stated, his heart heavy. It seemed like he had no choice but to bring his plans forward. The White Deer Institute, the first battle he would have to succeed. What do you plan to do next? Bai Lu Yi asked Qin Wendian. Qin Wendian smiled when he saw the seriousness in Bai Lu Yi's eyes. Don't worry, even if Di Feng from the Di clan fought with me, the victor would still be mine. So what if he was ranked number 5 on the Heavenly Fate rankings? Very soon, he would have the confidence to be on par with Di Feng. Not only that, if he was given more time, in a year or 2 at most, he would become the most dazzling ranker on the Heavenly Fate rankings. This was his conviction, and also his ambition. Let's go, I'll impart the ancient scroll of the Ascendant to you. Qin Wendian laughed. Bai Lu Yi also smiled as she stared at his handsome countenance. She believed that Qin Wentian would definitely win, no matter what challenges he had to face. Ranked number 11, Zhan Chen, number 18, Yang Fan, Zhao Lai, Hua Feng, and Qin Wentian, didn't they already snatch the inheritance right under their noses? So what if he was ranked number 5? In a place extremely far away from the moon continent, there was an ancient city where humans and demonic beasts coexisted, the Celestial Lake Palace. At this moment, the palace mistress of the Celestial Lake Palace was respectfully standing in the middle of the great hall, gazing at the peerless beauty seated before her. Fairy Qingmei lazily laid there, her beautiful eyes flickering with a demonic light. Her jade-like hands rapped on the chair as she asked in a low voice, "That old fellow, can't he stay idle any longer?" The news I received was that currently, the two major powers have already divided into two factions. No one is able to suppress the other, the palace mistress calmly replied. He, who would have thought that even before they could rise up, there would already be a worm growing within them. Even before the Azure Emperor token was issued, they already wanted to seize power. Fairy Qingmei's smile was filled with a trace of coldness. Seems like that's what they're thinking. During these years, they've gradually grown stronger and stronger, with many geniuses emerging from their ranks. Right now, Di Feng has already arrived at the White Deer Institute in the Moon Continent. The palace mistress of the Celestial Lake Palace seemed to be extremely familiar with the happenings in the Moon Continent. How are things going with Qing and that little fellow? Will that lass's heart be moved? A gentle smile involuntarily appeared on Fairy Qingmei's face as she thought of Qing. She should be fine, master should know of Qing's temperament. She's always cold and indifferent, it would be extremely difficult to make her enter the mortal world. The palace mistress bitterly smiled as she continued, as for that little fellow, he's not bad at all. Oh. Fairy Qingmei's gaze froze. It's rare for you to have such a high evaluation of him. Since this is the case, why don't you send some people out to take a look? Don't let that little fellow be too isolated. It's fine if nothing happens, but if there really is a conflict, at the very least, I should let them know my stance. Chapter 277. After Qin Wentian passed the scroll to Bai Luyi immediately immersed herself in it, forgetting everything else. She had always been infatuated with divine inscriptions. Now that she saw the profound Tao of divine inscriptions of a ascendant, she was like Qin Wentian back then, unable to extricate herself. The gold element ascendant's understanding of divine inscriptions, as well as the various combinations of divine inscriptions, were far superior compared to the White Deer Institute. What made Bai Luyi even more moved was that within the scroll, there were many powerful fourth-ranked divine inscriptions, fourth-ranked formations, fourth-ranked weaponsmithing techniques, and fourth-ranked puppetry. Sadly, she didn't have that level of attainment yet. She couldn't comprehend it, and could only comprehend it bit by bit. After Qin Wentian met with Chu Mang and the rest, he once again entered closed-door seclusion, staying with Bai Luyi in the White Deer Cavern. Little rascal naturally stayed by his side as well. In truth, Qin Wentian originally wanted to stay in the desert for a longer period of time. But when he thought of how worried Bai Luyi and Fan Lu would be, he hurriedly returned. Now that there was a chance to cultivate together with Bai Luyi, exchanging insights, it was a wonderful thing. However, Di Cheng's mood wasn't that wonderful. If the Di clan wanted to gain full control of the White Deer Institute, other than acknowledging them, they naturally had to maintain a good relationship with the Institute. And Di Feng, who had the potential to become the future leader of the Azure faction, was undoubtedly the most suitable person to do such a thing. If the White Deer Institute truly acknowledged him, they would naturally be willing to help him. In the world of cultivation, after benefits, relationships would naturally be the most important. As such, Di Feng had been staying in the White Deer Institute as a guest for the past few days. At the same time, he would visit the residences of the various elders. Occasionally, he would interact with the younger generation as well, and the White Deer Institute's impression of Di Feng was getting better and better. Di Cheng, on the other hand, wasn't feeling too good. those from the White Deer Institute didn't have a good impression of him. He was always idling around, and now that he heard that Bai Lu-yi was cultivating with a young man, how could he be in a good mood? Is little E still in closed-door seclusion? At this moment, Di Cheng asked. That girl. Bai Lu-yi's father shook his head. He knew that ever since Qin Wendian had returned, Bai Lu-yi had been stuck together with him. A grown girl couldn't be kept at home. He didn't know what was going on, and naturally assumed that Bai Lu-yi and Qin Wendian were together. However, he didn't object. After all, he was quite fond of Qin Wendian. At the very least, he was much better than Di Cheng. No matter what, they were both from the Di clan. How could there be such a huge disparity between Di Cheng and Di Feng? Father, it seems like your daughter is about to be abducted, Bai Lu Jing, who was standing at the side, laughed, as though he was intentionally speaking to Di Cheng. Sure enough, Di Cheng's expression changed slightly as he asked, Qin Wendian, who is he? How is he worthy of Xiao Yi? Di Cheng continued to address Bai Lu-yi as Little E. Bai Lu-yi's father and Bai Lu Jing were extremely unhappy, but they couldn't be bothered to correct him. After all, he was a guest. It doesn't matter if he's worthy or not, as long as Little E likes him. Bai Lu Jing intentionally provoked Di Cheng. And indeed, Di Cheng's countenance changed slightly. Master, Miss E, he's out. At this moment, a maid came to report. Bai Lu-yi's father's eyes brightened as he laughed, that lass, she's finally willing to come out. I'll go take a walk first. Di Cheng bid his farewell, causing Bai Lu-yi and Bai Lu-yi to glance at each other. Bai Lu-yi's father then turned to Bai Lu Jing, you should go take a look as well. Right. Bai Lu Jing nodded his head as he stood up and departed, heading in the direction of the White Deer Cavern. Not long after Qin Wendian and Bai Lu-yi exited the White Deer Cavern, there were already so many people in front of them, causing them to feel somewhat depressed. He's Di Cheng. Bai Lu-yi whispered to Qin Wendian. Qin Wendian swept his gaze over, instantly seeing Di Cheng's cultivation base, the 5th level of Yuanfu. Based on Di Cheng's age, this cultivation base wasn't anything special. After which, Qin Wendian saw the 2 elders of the White Deer Institute also passing by. Qin Wendian wanted to see if he could see their cultivation bases, but to his dismay, Qin Wendian discovered that he couldn't. This made Qin Wendian understand that even after he opened his third eye, he could only see the cultivation bases of Yuanfu cultivators. The elders of the White Deer Institute should all be at the Heavenly Dipper realm, hence he couldn't see through them. Little E, I've missed you so much these days. Di Cheng smiled at Bai Lu-yi, causing Qin Wendian to be taken aback. This fellow was truly a genius. Qin Wendian now believed that the reason why the Di clan sent Di Cheng here first to give the White Deer Institute a bad impression wasn't because Di Cheng was faking it. Di Cheng was truly such a person. Bai Lu-yi's countenance changed when she heard Di Cheng's words. Seeing Qin Wendian winking at her, she couldn't help but feel even angrier. Di Cheng, please call me by my name in the future, Bai Lu-yi stated in a depressed tone. After which, she hooked her arm around Qin Wendian's, pulling Qin Wendian along. She glared at Qin Wendian viciously. Who asked this bastard to make fun of her? Qin Wendian smiled bitterly. He was being used as a shield by Bai Lu-yi. Noticing the gazes of the crowd, Qin Wendian could only smile bitterly. Right now, it was impossible for those from the White Deer Institute to not misunderstand. He and Bai Lu-yi often cultivated together, and although there was nothing between them, those from the White Deer Institute wouldn't think so. Qin Wendian. Di Cheng blocked Qin Wendian's path of retreat. His eyes narrowed as a smile appeared on his face, yet it gave off a sinister feeling. You're blocking my way. Qin Wendian smiled as he looked at Di Cheng. I know. Di Cheng nodded his head. I heard that you're an unaffiliated cultivator with an average cultivation background. However, your attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions aren't bad, and you're a 3rd-ranked Divine Inscriptionist. Qin Wendian furrowed his brows. This Di Cheng was extremely clear about his background. And Qin Wentian's countenance was as calm as ever. Although divine inscriptionists are respected by others, that's only because they have value. They can help others forge divine weapons and puppets. Even for a powerful divine inscriptionist, if he doesn't know how to forge divine weapons, his status will still be limited. After all, it's impossible to rely on divine inscriptions to battle. Ultimately, for cultivators, what matters most is one's cultivation base. Di Cheng slowly explained, his words causing Qin Wentian to be speechless. This fellow blocked his path and said so much. Was he trying to show how outstanding he was? But the problem was, this Di Cheng himself wasn't that outstanding. Naturally, whether he was outstanding or not depended on who he was compared to. Di Cheng knew that he didn't have the qualifications to compete with Di Feng. But as for the person in front of him, he definitely had to suppress him. In fact, although Di Cheng appeared to be a silk pants, he wasn't stupid. He knew why the Di clan had sent him here first, and he understood his mission. He also knew that he wanted to woo Bai Lui not only because of her beauty, but also because of her status. As long as he married her, his status in the White Deer Institute would be completely different. And if he succeeded, the Di clan would definitely be extremely satisfied with him. Are you done? Qin Wentian stared at Di Cheng, his tone indifferent. It was as though he didn't even place Di Cheng in his eyes. Such a situation caused the smile in Di Cheng's eyes to grow colder. Did you not understand what I meant? Qin Wentian saw that Di Cheng wasn't willing to let him off the hook, and his countenance also grew sharper. Two terrifying beams of light pierced into Di Cheng's eyes, and in an instant, Di Cheng felt a sense of impending doom. He involuntarily retreated 2 steps, his countenance extremely unsightly to behold. Let's go. Qin Wentian spoke to Bai Lui. Bai Lui was like a young girl, quietly hugging his arm. This was a blatant show of flaunting, wanting Di Cheng to completely give up on her. Not far away, Bai Luyi's father and Bai Lu Jing both had bitter smiles on their faces as they witnessed this scene. Just like what Qin Wentian had predicted, the misunderstanding had deepened. Qin Wentian and Bai Lui lifted their feet, only to see Di Cheng blocking their path once again. The aura of a 5th-level Yuanfu cultivator erupted forth. Since you don't understand what I meant, let me tell you. Get the hell out of the White Deer Institute. Di Cheng's aura grew even more domineering, suppressing Qin Wentian. However, at this moment, Qin Wentian's footsteps didn't stop. 2 beams of terrifying golden light shot out from his eyes, sweeping over Di Cheng. Di Cheng instantly felt an intense pain in his eyes, as though the pressure of death was pressing down on him. Qin Wentian's majesty was something that couldn't be profaned. Boom! A powerful force slammed into his mind, causing him to groan in pain. His face turned pale. Qin Wentian acted as though nothing had happened as he continued walking forwards. Yet another piercing gaze landed on Di Cheng, causing his countenance to turn even paler. Di Cheng coughed out a mouthful of blood as his countenance turned even paler. Bzzz. Di Cheng released his astral souls, as astral light flashed. His entire body was enveloped by a layer of mysterious energy as he glared at Qin Wentian. Qin Wentian had already arrived in front of him. Stretching out his palms, he slammed out with his palms. Instantly, terrifying divine inscriptions intertwined with each other, transforming into a terrifying great rock. Di Cheng howled in rage as the claws of the great rock latched onto his chest. After which, he soared through the air and was flung out of the way. Stop! A cold voice rang out, only to see the silhouette of the old man behind Di Cheng trembling as he landed on Di Cheng's back. At the same time, he slammed out with his palms, destroying the great rock in the air. Di Cheng supported the body of the old man as he stood up. Blood could still be seen at the corners of his mouth, and the robes around his chest were torn apart. His countenance was extremely grim. It's not impossible to battle using divine inscriptions. At the very least, I can kill as many as I want. So, don't use your ignorance to show off, Qin Wentian indifferently stated. Di Qing coughed out yet another mouthful of blood. Chapter 278. After Di Qing found out that Bai Lu Yi and Qin Wentian had a close relationship, he inquired about Qin Wentian from the White Deer Institute. Those from the White Deer Institute were all extremely familiar with Qin Wentian, and Di Qing easily learned that Qin Wentian was a third-ranked divine inscriptionist with a cultivation base at the third level of Yuanfu. Not only that, Qin Wentian didn't have any background, and only got acquainted with Bai Lu Yi because of divine inscriptions. Hence, the conversation between Qin Wentian and Bai Lu Yi came to light. Although divine inscriptionists were highly respected, they were only proficient in using divine inscriptions to forge weapons and formations. Very few divine inscriptionists could use divine inscriptions in combat. When both sides clashed, who would give them the time to inscribe divine inscriptions? However, Qin Wentian had used facts to tell them that there were indeed people who could use divine inscriptions in combat. And right now, there was one. Not only that, it was as easy as flipping a palm to deal with him. The eyes of Bai Lu Jing and Bai Lu Yi's father brightened, as they gained a clearer understanding of Qin Wentian's attainments in the Tao of divine inscriptions. The path of divine inscriptions was as difficult as the martial path. Even if one had talent, they would need a long period of time to immerse themselves in it. There were many peak-tier third-ranked divine inscriptionists who were already at the peak of the Tao of divine inscriptions. For someone as young as Qin Wentian to have such attainments in the Tao of divine inscriptions, to the extent that he could even use it in combat, he was definitely a demon-level genius. One could imagine that sooner or later, Qin Wentian would become a fourth-ranked divine inscriptionist. At that time, his status would be completely different. If he could become a fourth-ranked divine inscriptionist before the age of 20, the weight of his achievements wouldn't be any less than the names on the heavenly fate rankings. At the very least, in the Moon continent, there had never been such a character. However, to advance from the third to the fourth level, was akin to advancing from Yuanfu to Heavenly Dipper. It was a huge hurdle that couldn't be easily overcome. At this moment, none of them noticed that not far away, an elder from the White Deer Institute had a brilliant glow in his eyes when he saw Qin Wentian's display of divine inscriptions. In the future, please don't come and harass little E. You are really not worthy. Qin Wentian stared at Di Cheng as he emotionlessly stated. Disregarding Di Cheng's status, he was only speaking from the point of view of Bai Lu Yi's friend. Bai Lu Yi was a pure and beautiful young lady, gentle and generous, with outstanding talent. Her man was definitely not someone like Di Cheng. Di Cheng was truly not qualified. Di Cheng's face alternated between green and white. What else could he do after being humiliated by Qin Wentian? Any words he said had lost their persuasiveness. As for hoping that the elders of the Di family would stand up for him, that was impossible. The Di family had come to the White Deer Institute to build a good relationship with them. If he couldn't even handle his own matters, why would the elders of the Di family bully a guest of the White Deer Institute, Qin Wentian? Di Qing could only admit defeat. Qin Wentian and Bai Lu Yi lifted their feet, preparing to leave. But before they could take a few steps, a gust of cold wind gusted over. Abruptly, another silhouette appeared, blocking Qin Wentian and Bai Lu Yi's path. Upon seeing this silhouette, Qin Wentian's countenance stiffened. What was going on today? Di Qing blocked their path, and now, there was another person blocking their path. Not only that, the person standing in front of him was actually an elder of the White Deer Institute. Although he didn't know who this person was, he had seen him a few times before. Grandpa Dong, what's wrong? Bai Lu Yi froze as she stared at the old man in front of her. Grandpa Tong was her elder, of the same generation as her grandfather. He was one of the 9 elders of the White Deer Institute, and could be considered as someone with great authority in the institute. His attainments in the Tao of divine inscriptions were extremely high, and he was a 4th-ranked grandmaster as well as a 4th-ranked divine inscriptionist. Not only that, he was also a heavenly dipper sovereign. Little brother Qin, I want to borrow something from you. Bai Lu Tong's eyes shone brightly as he stared at Qin Wentian. Qin Wentian politely replied, What item does Senior want to borrow? The ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant. As the sound of Bai Lu Tong's voice faded, Qin Wentian's eyes narrowed as he involuntarily turned his gaze onto Bai Lu Yi. Had the news of what happened in the secret realm already circulated out? Before this, he had heard from Bai Lu Yi that those from the transcendent powers had all kept their mouths shut. Nobody in the outside world knew what happened in the secret realm. At this moment, Bai Lu Yi was also stunned. She didn't expect that Bai Lu Tong would ask Qin Wentian for this. The ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant was incomparably valuable. Qin Wentian had given it to her because their relationship was extraordinary, and because he trusted her. However, Bai Lu Tong and Qin Wentian didn't have any interactions at all. Asking for such a valuable item out of the blue, no one would be happy, including Qin Wentian. When Bai Lu Tong saw the expressions on their faces, he instantly understood that the ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant was most probably in Qin Wentian's hands. I heard that little brother Qin had some good fortune in the secret realm and obtained the ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant. I have some knowledge in the field of divine inscriptions, and would little brother Qin please lend it to me to take a look? Bai Lu Tong continued. A golden light flickered in Qin Wentian's eyes. What status did Bai Lu Tong have? How valuable was the ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant? Although Bai Lu Tong said that he wanted to borrow it, in truth, it was a form of robbery. Senior must be joking. Junior's cultivation base is too low. How could I obtain the ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant in the secret realm? Qin Wentian stared into Bai Lu Tong's eyes as he casually laughed. Even if Bai Lu Tong knew, he wouldn't admit to it. The ancient scroll of the gold element ascendant had too many implications, and there was a high possibility that it would attract calamity. Regardless of whether others knew of it or not, he couldn't admit to it no matter what. Is that so? But the information I received shouldn't be wrong. Bai Lu Tong similarly stared at Qin Wentian as he laughed. Treasures could bring calamity to people's hearts. If it wasn't for the fact that Qin Wentian had a good relationship with Bai Lu Yi and was a guest of the White Deer Institute, Bai Lu Tong wouldn't have wasted so much time talking nonsense with him and would have directly acted to snatch it away. Snatching treasures was a very common thing in the martial arts world. Senior must be mistaken. Qin Wentian continued laughing. At this moment, Bai Lu Yi and Bai Lu Jing definitely wouldn't leak the news out. Even if they did, the first person to receive the news wouldn't be Bai Lu Tong. In that case, it could only be those young men from the transcendent powers who intentionally leaked the news. Since this is the case, little brother Qin, can you allow me to inspect your interspatial ring? Bai Lu Tong stared at the interspatial ring on Qin Wentian's finger. Such words were already extremely presumptuous. Who didn't have their own secrets? The interspatial ring was Wu Xiu's foundation. How could he allow others to inspect it? Grandpa Tong, you're going too far, Bai Lu Yi retorted. Although Bai Lu Tong was an elder, it was still too much to be so overbearing. Little Yi, this matter has nothing to do with you, Bai Lu Tong interjected. If it wasn't for Bai Lu Yi, he wouldn't have been so polite to Qin Wentian. You actually think that this has nothing to do with me? Bai Lu Yi's voice was filled with mockery. Her hand was still holding onto Qin Wentian's arm. You should understand the importance of the ancient scroll. Now that it's right in front of me, Grandpa Tong has to obtain it no matter what. Bai Lu Tong stared straight into Bai Lu Yi's eyes as he spoke with a voice that could sever nails and sever iron. Bai Lu Tong, enough. At this moment, a silhouette walked over from afar. It was none other than the large-eyed elder whom Qin Wentian had met before. Bai Lu Tong's countenance didn't change when he saw the large-eyed elder. As a divine inscriptionist, the ancient scroll of the Ascendant was right in front of him. Such temptation was simply irresistible. Grand Elder. I've said enough. The large-eyed elder reprimanded. Don't forget, not long ago, Qin Wentian was still fighting for our White Deer Institute's ranking in the refinement grounds. Humph, Bai Lu Tong flicked his sleeves and departed. Evidently, he wouldn't let this matter rest so easily. Many thanks, Grand Elder. Qin Wentian clasped his hands to the large-eyed elder. You are a guest of the White Deer Institute, this is something I should do. If I've offended you in any way, please don't take it to heart, the large-eyed elder replied. After which, he turned to Bai Lu Yi, little Yi, take good care of little brother Qin. Bai Lu Yi nodded her head in agreement, before leading Qin Wentian away. Qin Wentian once again returned to the grassy area behind the mountain. This place was quiet and tranquil, with a gentle breeze caressing his face, causing him to feel a sense of tranquility. Qin Wentian sat on the ground, staring at little rascal's snow-white body as a smile appeared on Qin Wentian's face. Stretching out his right hand, a sharp sword light appeared in his left hand, slicing through his palm, causing fresh blood to drip down. Little rascal, open your mouth, Qin Wentian spoke to little rascal. Yeah. Little rascal shook its head, an expression of extreme reluctance could be seen in its adorable eyes, as though it was angrily glaring at Qin Wentian. Back then when you followed me, you must have sensed my aura when you met me. I know that my blood is useful to you, and even if I lose a bit of blood, there won't be any side effects. I'll replenish it very quickly. Don't worry. Qin Wentian knew that one of his bloodlines was the terrifying demonic blood, and was extremely useful to demonic beasts. Upon hearing Qin Wentian's words, little rascal opened its mouth. Be good. Qin Wentian dripped a drop of blood into little rascal's mouth, and indeed, an instant later, a golden light flickered in its eyes as it ran to the side to sleep. Someone might have intentionally leaked the news, aren't you worried at all? Bai Lu Yi stared at the relaxed expression on Qin Wentian's face. Bai Lu Tong intercepting Qin Wentian had caused her to feel a sense of pressure. Even an elder of the Bai Lu Academy felt this way, let alone an outsider. Treasures bring calamity to people's hearts, what's the use of worrying? The only thing I can do is to grow stronger. Qin Wentian mumbled. Bai Lu Yi nodded her head, you're right. Although the predicament you're in might seem complicated, it's all because you're still too young, and your strength isn't strong enough. What did you say? Qin Wentian's eyes abruptly lit up, staring at Qin Wentian. Bai Lu Yi stared at the expression on Qin Wentian's face, bewilderment could be seen on her face. Qin Wentian didn't seem like someone who would get angry, right? You're still too young, and your strength isn't strong enough. If not, if you could intimidate them, you wouldn't be in this predicament today, Bai Lu Yi repeated. The previous sentence. Qin Wentian's heart pounded. Although the predicament you're in might seem complicated, it's all about simplicity, Bai Lu Yi murmured, not understanding Qin Wentian's meaning. Yes, although the predicament you're in might seem complicated, it's all about simplicity. Qin Wentian drew in a deep breath, feeling enlightened. He inclined his head, feeling the cool breeze blowing against his face, as he felt a sense of enlightenment. From simplicity to complexity, that's refinement, from complexity to simplicity, that's comprehension, Qin Wentian mumbled. Bai Lu Yi's beautiful eyes flickered, she was completely at a loss. Only to see Qin Wentian squatting down, his palms slashing out in front of him. Instantly, a straight line streaked through the air, containing a surge of energy within it. Bai Lu Yi stared at the streak of light, her heart filled with bewilderment. She walked forward and similarly squatted down, infusing a strand of astral energy into it. Instantly, a terrifying sharpness gushed forth as a beam of sword light pierced through the air, startling Bai Lu Yi so much that she fell to the ground. Her beautiful eyes stared in shock at Qin Wentian as she stared at him. You broke through. Bai Lu Yi's heart trembled, her voice filled with excitement. Qin Wentian smiled as he nodded his head, exuding a carefree air. The confidence radiating from him grew even stronger. Chapter 279. Bai Lu Yi's heart pounded wildly, her beautiful eyes unblinkingly fixed on Qin Wentian. 4th level. Bai Lu Yi's sexy lips twitched, her voice trembling slightly. In the Moon continent, 4th-ranked inscriptionists were at least in their 40s or 50s, and there were even some who were over 100 years old. These dazzling geniuses preferred to spend most of their time on the path of cultivation, and hence, there weren't that many demon-level inscriptionists. Qin Wentian was definitely one of a kind. He already had extraordinary attainments in the path of cultivation, and his talent in the Tao of divine inscriptions was even more monstrous. Not yet. Qin Wentian laughed. Bai Lu-yi lightly patted her chest upon hearing his words. She didn't know how seductive this action was to men. Then why are you trying to scare me? Bai Lu-yi glared at Qin Wentian. What grade of divine inscription is this? Qin Wentian laughed as he pointed to the inscription that appeared to be a straight line, but was actually imbued with a powerful sword might. Third ranked. Bai Lu-yi stared at Qin Wentian. Although he hadn't broken through to the fourth-ranked inscriptionist realm, the fact that he had such an achievement was already an astonishing feat. How many people could inscribe third-ranked inscriptions with just a lift of their hands? Even fourth-ranked inscriptionists couldn't do so. Inscribing third-ranked inscriptions with just a lift of your hands is indeed a major breakthrough. Bai Lu-yi smiled. You've reminded me, from complexity to simplicity. Qin Wentian laughed. Before this, from the simplest divine inscription all the way up to the third level, the process of inscribing the divine inscriptions from the simplest to the complex. One stroke at a time, and more strokes at the end, the divine inscriptions would intertwine with each other, forming a brand new divine inscription. But now, if I want to step into the fourth level, the difficulty of inscribing a fourth-level divine inscription would be unimaginable. But of course, this is a stage that all divine inscriptionists have to go through. Isn't it the same for all divine inscriptionists? The inscribing of divine inscriptions is already exceedingly difficult. This is also the reason why so many geniuses are willing to cultivate. Although fourth-ranked inscriptionists are equivalent to Heavenly Dipper sovereigns, it's an undeniable fact that Heavenly Dipper sovereigns can easily kill fourth-ranked inscriptionists. Others wouldn't wait for you to slowly inscribe fourth-ranked inscriptions. Qin Wentian naturally understood this logic. This was also the reason Di Qing used to humiliate him. If not, with his attainments in the Tao of inscriptions at the peak of the third ranked, he was already equivalent to someone at the peak of Yuan Fu. Martial Tao and divine inscriptions couldn't be compared directly. However, this wouldn't affect the respect of powerful divine inscriptionists. A fourth-ranked divine inscriptionist meant that they had the ability to inscribe fourth-ranked formations and forge fourth-ranked divine weapons. As such, there would be many people who would seek help from them, including Heavenly Dipper sovereigns. On the path of martial Tao, there are countless transformations. Everyone has their own methods of cultivation, and the Tao of divine inscriptions is the same as well. Others have their own methods of cultivation, but I have my own philosophy. From complexity to simplicity, this is what I've comprehended. Although I haven't stepped into the fourth-ranked divine inscriptions yet, it's only a matter of time before I succeed. Qin Wentian smiled. His path in the Tao of divine inscriptions was closely related to the spirit refinement method he cultivated. The spirit refinement method borrowed the power of divine inscriptions to condense divine energy. For the first level of the spirit refinement method, one would be able to condense any first-ranked divine energy in an instant. For the second level of the spirit refinement method, one would be able to condense any second-ranked divine energy in an instant. Currently, although Qin Wentian hadn't reached the level where he could condense any third-ranked divine energy in an instant, he could at least condense some simple third-ranked divine energy in an instant. This indicated that his spirit refinement method had already reached the third level of the spirit refinement method, and was only a sliver away from the perfection boundary. The spirit refinement method was the foundation of his current attainments in the Tao of divine inscriptions. Does this mean that you'll be able to step into the fourth rank soon? Since I've comprehended it, the fourth-ranked divine inscriptions is only a matter of time. With a single thought, it shouldn't be too difficult for me to break through to the fourth-ranked. Qin Wentian laughed, causing Bai Lu-yi's heart to palpitate once more. A 19-year-old fourth-ranked divine inscriptionist. Just thinking about it caused her heart to thump wildly. I have to go into closed-door seclusion again. Qin Wentian bitterly smiled. Although he valued the martial path more than the Tao of Divine Inscriptions, the Tao of Divine Inscriptions would allow him to gain the recognition of the White Deer Institute within a short period of time. Hence, he could only choose to break through to the fourth-ranked Divine Inscriptions first. In that case, even though he wasn't even 19 years of age, his status wouldn't be inferior to many of the heavenly rankers on the Heavenly Fate rankings. The White Deer Institute would also view him in a new light, valuing him from the bottom of their hearts. Okay, do your best in closed-door seclusion. You must definitely break through, okay? Bai Lu raised her dainty fist to Qin Wendian, her innocent smile exceptionally beautiful. As long as you step into the fourth-ranked Divine Inscriptionist realm, the weight of the Azure Emperor Medallion will be even greater. Qin Wendian smiled as he nodded his head. The weight of the Azure Emperor Medallion from a fourth-ranked Divine Inscriptionist, and that of a fourth-level Yuanfu cultivator, were on two completely different levels. Bai Lu lifted her hands and clenched them into fists. Qin Wendian, upon seeing her actions, did the same as well. After which, their fists lightly bumped into each other as they exchanged a smile. After which, Bai Lu departed. Qin Wendian drew in a deep breath as he sat down cross-legged. Time was of the essence. He had to take out the Azure Emperor Medallion before the White Deer Institute fully recognized Di Feng. If not, once the faction represented by Di Feng gained the support of the White Deer Institute, everything would be too late. In the quiet back mountain, the grass was lush and green. Sunlight, rain and dew, as well as a light breeze, nourished the soil. A young man sat there quietly, as though he was isolated from the rest of the world. Nothing could disturb his heart. Beside the young man, a snow-white puppy was sitting cross-legged like the young man, looking extremely adorable. However, what was even more shocking was that every time night fell, the snow-white puppy would quietly lie down on the ground. From the heavens above, starlight would cascade into its body, causing its body to glow with a golden light. During the day, the puppy would get up and run around, occasionally sticking out its tongue and licking the pants of the young man. It was as though the young man was its kin. Chu Mang and Fan Le had always been active in the various locations of the Moon continent. The Hell Arena had become a training ground for them, and there were times when they would meet with ruthless opponents, causing them to be in a life-or-death situation. However, as they continued to temper themselves, their combat prowess grew stronger and stronger. Chu Mang's cultivation base had long stepped into the 6th level of Yuanfu, while Fan Le had already stepped into the 4th level of Yuanfu. Chu Mang and Fan Le would often spar against each other. Although Fan Le's cultivation base was inferior to Chu Mang's, the power of his bloodline had grown stronger and stronger. Hence, he was able to spar against Chu Mang, and in addition to the fact that both of them were proficient in archery, they would often spar against each other. The Moon continent was indeed much more interesting compared to a small country like Chu. Many things happened in the Moon continent during this period of time. There was news that a young man named Qin Wendian had entered the secret grounds of Divine Inscriptions together with the star-seizing manner, and under a stroke of good fortune, he managed to obtain the ancient scroll of the Ascendant of the Ascendant. As this news circulated, it instantly caused a huge wave of commotion. Many powerful fourth-ranked grandmasters all had their own ideas. The Gold Element Ascendant was a legendary expert, and he was also a terrifying fifth-ranked grandmaster. One could very well imagine how attractive the ancient scroll of divine inscriptions he inherited was to fourth-ranked grandmasters. After which, when they found out that Qin Wendian was in the White Deer Institute, many of them were disappointed. The White Deer Institute was a major power that was extremely proficient in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions. Since Qin Wendian was in the White Deer Institute, the ancient scroll of Divine Inscriptions must have already fallen into their hands. After their investigations, they discovered that Qin Wendian had never stepped out of the White Deer Institute. It was very likely that he was under house arrest. And while the gazes of many in the Moon continent were on Qin Wendian, he was still in the back mountains of the White Deer Institute. Today, in the White Deer Institute, Bai Lu Yu and two other young men were heading towards the back mountains. However, at the foot of the mountain, they were obstructed by Bailu Yi. Little Yi, what do you mean by this? Bailu Yu spoke to Bailu Yi, his countenance filled with unhappiness. Uncle Yu, I know what you are doing. He's currently in closed-door seclusion, it's not a good time to disturb him. Bailu Yi stared at Bailu Yu. Bailu Yu was the eldest son of Bailu Tong and had some attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions. However, his attainments in the Tao of Divine Inscriptions weren't very high. Since when did the back mountains of my White Deer Institute become occupied by an outsider? Why can't I go there? Bailu Yu coldly laughed. Not only that, I'm not the one looking for him today. There are quite a few guests who wish to meet with Qin Wentian. You should know who these guests are, right? He won't meet with them. Bailu Yi confidently replied. She naturally knew who these people were. Recently, there were quite a few fourth-ranked grandmasters who came to the White Deer Institute, wanting to meet with Qin Wentian. The White Deer Institute didn't reject them. The status of a fourth-ranked grandmaster was already extraordinary, and in addition to the fact that there were some people who wanted to make use of the pressure from the outside world to threaten Qin Wentian, how could she not understand? With so many important characters here, as long as the White Deer Institute gave up on Qin Wentian, he would be in an extremely dangerous situation outside. Cooperating with the White Deer Institute and handing over the treasure to them was undoubtedly the best choice. Is that so? Little Yi, is your friend really so arrogant? He doesn't even want to meet with a fourth-ranked grandmaster. Bailu Yu coldly laughed. Even if he doesn't want to meet with me, he should be the one to answer me personally. After speaking, Bailu Yu continued walking forwards. Bailu Yi's beautiful eyes flashed as her silhouette flickered, blocking Bailu Yu's path. Impudent! Bailu Yu coldly snorted as his aura gushed forth. It was as though he no longer cared about face. Even if he had to make a move, he still wanted to meet with that person in the back mountains. Bailu Yi's beautiful eyes turned ashen, extremely unsightly to behold. Since Senior wishes to meet with me, feel free to do so. An ethereal voice drifted over from the back mountains, causing Bailu Yi's beautiful eyes to freeze. The owner of this voice was someone she was too familiar with. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.